Good morning, everyone. How's the audio sound? A little better today? Okay, it sounds better from my end. Well, welcome everyone to day 2 of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council's August 2022 meeting. We are in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My name is Mike Luisi, and I represent the state of Maryland on the council and also on the Summer Flounder Scup and Black Sea Bass Board, who is convened with us today jointly. I am joined by Dr. Justin Davis from Connecticut. So Justin and I will be moving through both board and council actions as necessary as we make our way through the agenda for this morning. I wanted to make just a few notes. Yesterday we were having some audio difficulty, and so when you do have an opportunity to speak, if you can try your best to pull your microphone as close to you as possible and speak directly into the microphone rather than turning your head to talk to somebody at the other side of the room. It'll help, I think, for all of us to hear, make sure we hear clearly, and for the folks who are online so that they can understand what we're saying here in the room as well. We are convened today. We have a number of council members and board members in the room. And however, this meeting is a hybrid style meeting, which means that there are a handful of members from the board and the council who are participating online, as well as members of the public who are participating online. So Justin and I will do our best to make sure that not only the representatives around the table who are participating virtually have an opportunity to speak, but I also want to make sure that the public has an opportunity, whether they're here today or they're online. We'll make sure that there's an opportunity for public comment as we debate the issues on the agenda for this morning and this afternoon. Let's see, other notes of interest. If my family, for some reason, is listening, I wanted everyone to know that I'm wearing my my Christmas present this year, my Philadelphia Eagles tie. It's I had to cut the tags off of it this morning, and I don't have too many chances to wear it, so I figured while we're in Philly, I'll certainly flaunt the Eagles. So not that anyone's listening, because they don't know what I do or care anything about it. So that's just in case somebody had logged on today to listen. Good morning, family. Okay, so we're going to get started today. Let me turn to Justin, though, to see if was there anything that you wanted to add, Justin, for the board?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Nothing to add at this time.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started on our first item on today's agenda. We have Brandon Muffley here with us from council staff, who's going to give us a presentation regarding the ecosystems approaches to fisheries management, the recreational summer flounder management strategy evaluation. There will be an opportunity to ask questions and discuss, updates from Brandon on the work that's being done after the presentation. So before I do that, though, just to be thinking about it, we did this yesterday and it seemed to work pretty well. And we've done this before for the hybrid meetings. I'm going to try to manage hands on my screen. So if you are sitting in the room and you have a question or you'd like to provide comment, if you can raise your hand online, if you have a computer or some type of mobile device in front of you that allows you to do that, I'll call on hands as they come up on my screen. For the public that's here, I'll certainly, if you have a comment or question, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. And I realize that some people may be participating by phone only. And if you don't have an opportunity to raise your hand, there'll be a chance. I'll just ask for anyone that has additional comments from that are participating on the phone only. You will be able to just start to speak, and we'll acknowledge your comment at that point. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started. Brandon, if you're ready to go, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, council and board, and thanks for the opportunity to present on our management strategy evaluation work today. I'm really excited to to be here to talk about it. I think we have a lot of interesting and valuable sort of results that came out of the management strategy evaluation. So I'm really excited to present that information to you today. So we have a number of different things to get through today, and I'm only going to be one of the speakers that we'll go through. I'm going to pass the baton to a few other folks as we step through the presentation. So you'll also hear from Dr. Gavin Fay, Dr. Jonathan Cummings, and Dr. Lou Carr-Harrison. So that we'll switch back and forth depending upon the specific topic. So we'll start to give you all an overview of the process and how we develop the management strategy evaluation, just to refresh everybody's memory. We'll give a really sort of broad overview of the model and management considerations that we step through. Talk about the sort of key takeaways. We'll dive in a little bit deeper on some of the results, talk through some of the broader takeaways from the management strategy evaluation project, and then we'll get through the sort of next steps and what the expectations are with the meeting today. There are a lot of outputs that were produced through the management strategy evaluation, and we will not get through all of them today because there's just a lot of information there. We're really going to sort of hit at those key take-homes that we learned, but there is the website there where folks can look at all of the model outputs that we've created, where you can look at outputs by performance metric, by different operating models, by state. So you can look at all of those things there. So I encourage everybody to go there if you haven't already to look at some of those more detailed outcomes. And before I get started, and the small group of us presenting today are really here today, on behalf of a much larger group that worked on this management strategy evaluation. And so we had a technical work group of experts in management strategy evaluation, stock assessment work, economics, across federal, state, and academia. We had a quarter of our SSC were actually technical work group members. So we had a lot of people, both within the council process and within the commission process, that served on the technical work groups that guided us through the entire process. And then we had a core stakeholder group of recreational and commercial fishermen that really worked very closely with the technical work group and provided us feedback over the last year of this project and really helped guide where we want to go with this project. And they brought a lot of different expertise to the table. And so without those two groups, we wouldn't be where we are today with the results that we're going to show you in a little bit. And I also want to thank, we also had leadership from council and the board participate throughout the entire process. So Adam Nowalski, Justin Davis, Tony Delernia, and Peter Defer. There's actually some members on that list that aren't even on the council anymore. That's how long this management strategy evaluation has been going on. But they have been participating in technical work group meetings. They've attended workshops. And so their input throughout the process was really valuable as well. So now that we're at the end of our management strategy evaluation, I just want to take a step back to the actual beginning of the process and how we got from our EAFM process all the way to the management strategy evaluation. So if you recall, this MSE is part of the council's implementation of our ecosystem approach to fisheries management guidance document, where the council identified a very specific process that they would take in order to incorporate ecosystem information into the management process. And so in 2018, we finished our risk assessment, and out of that risk assessment, we identified summer flounder as our high-risk fishery. We then moved into a conceptual model development where we looked at summer flounder within its ecosystem and modeled sort of everything conceptually there and how things are linked. And out of that conceptual model, the council agreed to move forward with the management strategy evaluation goals that we talked about, that we're going to work through, the biological and economic benefits of minimizing recreational discards, how we can convert those discards into landings, and then identify management strategies to realize those benefits. So that was our broad goal that we were working with through this management strategy evaluation. And the council was really interested in moving forward with that because it was a unique opportunity to align all of our EAFM work with our traditional management process, right? So you all are always thinking about on an annual basis, landings and discard related issues within our recreational fisheries. And this was a good opportunity to sort of connect those two to make sure our EAFM work is aligning and informing our traditional management information. And this management strategy evaluation allowed us to look at things a little bit differently, right? We were allowed to develop models and present information that we traditionally don't think of, or that you all have in front of you when you're making these management decisions. So as you all have been thinking about regulatory discards within our recreational fisheries for a long period of time, and this was a unique opportunity to look at things a little bit differently than we traditionally have. And so why do a management strategy evaluation? What are the benefits of going through this process? And it's really the opportunity to identify sort of management strategies that and allow us to look at and compare their performance and how they achieve different management objectives that you all may have. And many times we have conflicting management objectives. And given those conflicting objectives, the management strategy evaluation really allows us to quantify and balance those trade-offs, right? Typically, we're not going to find one strategy that resolves all of our objectives, particularly when they're conflicting. But how can we can identify what things might be most important to management, and you can look at those within a trade-off, sort of context. And you'll hear me sort of mention this throughout this presentation, again, sort of really focusing on this ecosystem component. This is an EAFM project, although it's very specific to recreational and our sort of traditional management. We're thinking about things more in an ecosystem context throughout this. And so the MSE allows us to think about sort of these system and ecosystem drivers and key uncertainties as we go through this. So what might be some environmental or stock dynamics or data uncertainties that we might be interested with an ecosystem context to be thinking about through this management strategy evaluation? It also allows us to think about things through the entire management cycle. And we'll show this as we talk about the simulation framework that we've created here. But you can start out with what we think the population of summer flounder looks like. We feed that through a pseudo stock assessment model. We implement management measures. We look at what those management measures meant in terms of harvest and discards and what those might mean in terms of the population. And it sort of feeds back through that loop again. So we're starting from the population, going through the assessment and management process, implementing those management measures and looking at what those implications may mean. And we can really evaluate the entire management cycle through this process, which is really helpful. Really critical component of a management strategy evaluation is allows us to test all of these different management strategies before we implement them, right? So we can identify which things don't work very well. We can be this plane stuck in the tree here, right? We can do a lot of simulations and crash a lot of computer planes. And that's okay to crash a lot of computer planes. We don't want to crash a real plane. So it allows us to figure out what things work and what things don't work through this sort of simulation framework, which is really a key critical component of this. And we go through this entire process. It doesn't make the decisions that we have to go through any easier, but hopefully the process and the engagement with stakeholders that we've had allows us to open up a conversation about these issues, and we're able to present new and different information that we weren't able to present before. And hopefully, if we've done everything correctly, at the end of this, we'll not only have tools that help inform the management strategy evaluation, we're going to have tools available to us where we can use for future council priorities and issues that may come up. So just quickly to sort of go through the last 2 years of work in regards to the management strategy evaluation, really, we broke this down into 2 specific phases. And so phase 1 was really the public scoping and engagement phase. So back in the middle of 2020, we started this process with the technical work group, got formed up, and we really wanted to initially kick off everything with our APs. Sort of introduce the concept of management strategy evaluation. What is it all about? What are we trying to do here? And so from there, then we move to a broader sort of stakeholder engagement and input phase. And so we held an online scoping questionnaire, and we held a series of regional workshops to get a lot of feedback from stakeholders regarding what they see are the critical issues for summer flounder management. What things should we be thinking about as we move forward with this management strategy evaluation? And that information really set the foundation for what we would move forward with then. So all of that, we synthesized all of that information that we got through that sort of broad scoping through the online feedback form and then through the recreational workshops or regional workshops. That information then started our conversations with the core stakeholder group. And so we really wanted to make sure that we had early involvement with stakeholders. So we started this entire project with stakeholders, and we had stakeholders contributing to this process until the very end. And so it was really important for us to make sure we are getting that input from stakeholders throughout. And I think it's really helped us come out with a better product at the very end. And so with all of that information, we moved into the sort of management application and model development phase. So the technical work group worked with this core stakeholder group through a series of 5 workshops through mid-2021 until just the end of June of this year. And really each sort of workshop built upon each other workshop. So I think we introduced and talked about the models at every single workshop that we ran. So we introduced concepts in those early workshops, got some initial feedback from the core stakeholder group in terms of the direction we wanted to be taking, thinking about some of those management considerations. They would offer their feedback. The technical work group would then go back and sort of figure out how we wanted to incorporate all of the information that the core stakeholder group were providing to us. And so we went through this sort of iterative process of getting that input from the stakeholder group. The technical work group would then go back, begin to develop models to incorporate the feedback that we were getting. And we would then present that information back to the core group. What are we missing? What do we have right? What do we have wrong? What do we need to be thinking about as we continue to refine these things? And so it was a really collaborative process between the core group and the technical work group that I think worked really well. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gavin Fay, who's going to run us through a few slides regarding the modeling approach. Oh, go ahead, Gavin.
Thank you, Brandon. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you, everybody, for giving us the opportunity to talk to you today. So Dr. Carr Harris and I talked quite extensively about the modeling at a previous meeting. But sort of as Brandon was just alluding to with sort of the process, we wanted to make sure that we sort of reframed the modeling before we dived into the results. So with that continued sort of engaged process, our modeling approach really centered on trying to target the model design and the model specifications to the questions that we had to hand for this particular problem. So that's really making decisions with regards to the models to really make sure that we're able to emulate the characteristics of the fishery system that are really important for the question that we're asking in terms of, are there options for recreational fishery in terms of improving harvest and reducing discards. So that was our main task. And so I think really a lot of our decisions, both within the working group, the modeling subgroup, and the core group, were really framed around that context. And so we chose this coupled modeling approach, was linking some existing population dynamics, fishery models, and economic models, really as a way so that we can, spend more time ensuring that we're kind of representing what we were hearing from the stakeholders and the technical working group in terms of what we needed to implement, and less time on programming new models and then having to test the performance of those before we actually used them. This coupled approach has a population dynamics model for the summer flounder population and a fishery model that's emulating the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery. It includes a representation of our assessment and management advice process, so that we can, fully sort of explore the impacts of not only uncertainty with the assessment and management, but also the changing, the effects of changing various regulations, in this case with the recreational fishery, on the performance of the fishery as a whole. Because our focus is on the rec fishery, we wanted to make sure that we were able to represent the types of decisions that are made for the recreational fishery dynamics, which we tend to manage. We include things like size limits in recreational management, and so that sort of led us to wanting to make sure that we could include the length structure of the population that is available to the fishery, and model changes in that as part of our modeling approach. This modeling approach also had to make sure that we could simulate the response of the recreational fishery to both the stock availability. So how does the recreational fishery respond to changing abundance and biomass of flounder, and then also thinking about how that works, or how that plays out at various spatial scales. So thinking about both the stock-wide perspective or coast-wide perspective, but also sort of regional and state-specific measures. And so our modeling really tried to incorporate all of those things too. And then what MSE, I think, is a strength that it really allows us to do is to think about how, when there are feedbacks between the impacts of management measures onto the stock dynamics, and how those play out over time in order to understand management performance. And so making sure that we were able to include the feedback of how recreational fishery responds to both those changes in regulations, but also the changes to stock dynamics within our simulations was really important. And I think that's one thing that this approach allows us to do well. Next slide, please. So I've shown this before, but MSEs typically involve this kind of simulation model. We're projecting forward, and we're trying to projecting forward through time in the computer. We're trying to emulate that full sort of management advice process and then the dynamics. So we would have, we have a population model for the summer flounder. This was age, length, and sex structured, and we include a fishing model, so we're fishing that stock. We include length-based fishing for both commercial and recreational fisheries, and there are fleets just like the current stock assessment for summer flounder. We have both landings and discard fleets for both the commercial and recreational fishery. These models were conditioned or initialized based on the sort of our current understanding of the summer flounder population in the fishery. So to really sort of emulate our sort of what our best estimates of stock status and productivity are at the moment for the population, we did a bunch of validation to ensure that the model dynamics are sort of representing the types of information that we collect from the fishery well. And we, so effectively the population model and fishery model here is very similar to the model that we use for stock assessment, but it does allow us to include, directly include the implications of changes in the size structure of the fishery, which, our current assessment doesn't. So that was sort of an important aspect. The projection model sequence, we also have an assessment, an emulation of the stock assessment. In this case, we simplified or streamlined the assessment and management models within our frameworks so that we could focus more of our time on the model for the recreational fishery. So we emulate the stock assessment by calculating what our OFL is from the, and then with uncertainty generating our estimates and applying the SSC's risk policy, well, the council's risk policy to the with the SSC's estimates of scientific uncertainty in order to derive ABCs. Those are then allocated to the commercial landings and discards and the recreational, as per the current allocations. And then importantly, this information on the stock availability, so the simulated population availability, is passed to the recreational demand model, which is a separate submodel that is able to simulate what the harvest and release at length would be given that current availability and a set of management regulations which correspond to state or region or coastwide settings for bag limit, size limit, season length, etc. That recreational demand model then sort of uses that information to, based on validated and calibrated models that are fit to real data for the recreational fishery, and then it predicts what the given the regulations, a particular set of regulations, is able to predict what that recreational harvest and discard would be. It's this model on which Dr. Andrew Carr-Harris talked about at the previous meeting, but he can go into detail in question and answers, I'm sure. It also calculates kind of our expected effects of the population size and management regulations on things like the magnitude of recreational fishing efforts, so the number of trips, the angler satisfaction and welfare, and then also sort of aggregate trip expenditures and what those impacts, economic and social benefits and impacts are to downstream businesses. So by coupling our sort of typical population dynamics and fishery model to this behavioral model for the recreational fishery, we're really able to expand the range of social and economic metrics that we're able to calculate in terms of thinking about the performance of these fishery management options for the socioeconomics of the system. That previous slide, please, Brendan. So closing the loop, once that recreational demand model simulates that sort of expected harvest and release at length, that is then passed back into the fishery model, which is then used to update the population dynamics. And so that allows us to project the summer flounder population forwards through time, given this feedback from the recreational fishery and the management application advice. Next slide, Brendan. Thank you. So I think I probably just talked through this, but I think this inclusion of this recreational demand model is really, I think, one of the really novel and really exciting parts of this analysis, because it not only allows us to incorporate, how fishing effort, the magnitude of catch or removals from the population response to regulations, but it also allows us to sort of quantify the economic benefit to anglers. And it's important to include this, feedback, I think, because we know that changes in, fishing effort will directly impact the fishing mortality. But that sort of the understanding where and what is being changed in terms of the impacts of regulations on anglers in different states and different regions really allows us to sort of reflect those values and preferences that our stakeholders were telling us through the engagement process. And with that, I think I'm going to, I realize that was a very fast churn through the modeling, but hopefully it reminds you of things, and I'll pass that back to Brandon right now, who's going to sort of talk about the objectives and the structure of the experiments that we were able to conduct.
Great, thanks, Gavin. Yeah, so I just have a few slides to set us up in regards to thinking about the actual results that you're going to see in the next few slides. So, I had presented on the earlier slide sort of what the broad objectives were that the council identified through our EAFM process in regards to looking at discards and how we can minimize discards and transfer those to landings. But those were generally quite broad and didn't offer sort of a lot of guidance for other considerations, right? So we may be able to, under the original set of objectives, we may be able to come up with management scenarios that reduce discards, but it may have a significant impact on, a state or a particular region in regards to, the actual implementation of those regulations. So thinking about more comprehensively how we want to actually evaluate translating and reducing discards and converting it into harvest. Through the scoping process and stakeholder feedback, we identified a number of other objectives that we may want to be thinking about in the context of reducing discards. And so we have 4 additional objectives that we're thinking about in this context of reducing discards. So one is improving the quality of the angler experience. Number 2 is maximizing the equity of anglers' experience, maximizing stock sustainability, and then maximizing the socioeconomic sustainability of the fishery. So that was the context that we were trying to think about as we develop the models, develop the metrics that we'd be thinking about. How do the different metrics that we've identified achieve these different objectives that we have identified here? And so we have 17 performance metrics. I'm not going to run through those now. We'll talk about those as we run through the actual results themselves. But these 17 metrics, we have at least 4 metrics for each of these 4 different objectives. We've calculated them depending upon the specific metric. They were calculated either at the trip level, at a state or region, or at a coast-wide level. I would note there were a lot of other metrics that the core group and stakeholders were interested in looking at. For example, mode-specific metrics. But we just either, there were a lot of things that we've talked about. We also talked about improving angler education or changing enforcement and all of these other things that we may be interested in thinking about, but we just didn't have either the data available to evaluate it at the scale that folks were interested in, or we just didn't have the time. And so we needed to prioritize what we're actually going to present. And so we came up with those final set of 17 performance metrics to look at. Then we came up with the management procedures that we came up with. And so we'll interchange some of these management procedures as sort of the term used within the management strategy evaluation world, but we also can call them management strategies, or they're just regulations, essentially. They're recreational regulations. And so we spent a lot of time working with the core group, developing these different management procedures. And I want to emphasize here that these were example regulations. These weren't necessarily intended to be regulations that would be specifically be implemented in 2023, for example, but were meant to capture a range of sort of the universe that recreational management would likely operate in. And we wanted to make sure that the different management procedures that we looked at were also different enough from one another that we could evaluate the differences. So we came up with these sort of broader categories and sort of evaluated and came up with different options within each. So the green set of options is essentially working off of the status quo regulations. And what status quo for here is 2019 regulations. Again, we started this process in 2020. The stock assessment goes through 2019, and at the time, the 2019 regulations were essentially the same regulations in 2019, 2020, and 2021. Management and stakeholders had a good idea of how those regulations were performing, so we thought that that would be a good baseline status quo regulations to sort of evaluate against. I know a lot of regulations changed in 2022, and so we didn't want to sort of conflate what might have happened in 2022 versus what had happened previously, where management and anglers were unhappy with how the recreational fishery was proceeding. So we looked at a few different options within the status quo regulations, where option 2 really just drops the minimum size for every state. So everything else stays the same, possession limits, seasons stay the same for all the states. We just drop every state 1 inch, only down to a minimum size of 16 inches. We didn't go to anything lower than 16 inches under that one. The third option just looks at a change to the season length to see how important seasons may be. Another one was a regional approach, but we identified different regions, right? So a lot of the feedback that we got through the scoping process was equity across states. And there's too many regulations. It's confusing to follow regulations. And so we tried to come up with something that sort of helped minimize some of those changing regulations and some consistency between states. And so we looked at the black sea bass as we set up regions similar to what black sea bass is set up. And then we identified regulations within each of those regions. So the same regulation would apply to each state within that particular region. Then we looked at some coast-wide options. We did look at one here that had a 14-inch minimum size, which is the same as the commercial minimum size. So that was something that the core group, we ran the models with that, presented the results to the core group. They did not like that. Again, that's one of the benefits of the management strategy evaluation, is to identify things that we don't like through the process. But it was actually really informative. We talked through a lot of things. We learned some things by running that scenario to help us set some of our other uncertainties and assumptions that we needed to make through the other models, so it was really helpful that we ran through it, even though we didn't ended up keeping it through the end. And we have this coast-wide management option that was sort of a middle ground between what all of the states were experiencing. And then we have 2 different slot limit options. One is this modified slot. It's sort of modeled after what New Jersey implemented in 2022, but we sort of expanded it a little bit to take technical committee feedback. So we expanded that smaller size range of the slots. So New Jersey's current slot is only a 1-inch slot limit. So here it's a 3-inch slot limit. And we switched where the greater possession limits would be. So we put 1 fish in that smaller slot and 2 fish at the higher slot. And then the last option was an actual true slot limit option. Again, these were meant to be examples. These weren't, so there are tweaks that could be done here. These were examples to evaluate how these different management procedures might perform. And then we created 3 different operating model scenarios. And this was really sort of an outcome of all of the stakeholder outreach that we got, plus really, again, going back to this ecosystem considerations that we wanted to be thinking about. So we heard a lot from stakeholders and through the core group about concerns regarding the MRIP information, and generally that folks feel that the MRIP estimates of effort and catch and harvest are high. And so what we did here is we initialized and calibrated the models based off of the assumption that the data from MRIP is biased high. And so we use the lower 95% confidence interval as our point estimate instead of the median point estimate that we traditionally use for management. We use the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval instead. And then we also looked at the distribution shift and how continued changes in the future of stock distribution, how that may impact regional availability to anglers. And so we wanted to look at how those things may play out if the stock continues to shift and move into different regions, what those implications may mean for recreational availability. So some of those sort of really important considerations to be thinking about from an ecosystem perspective. And so lastly, the last slide before we get into the actual results, just to give a quick reminder, what we did for each management procedure, it was simulated 100 times across a 26-year projection period. So that's essentially 13 stock assessments would have taken place over that 26-year projection period and 13 management cycles. So you would have set an ABC 13 times over that projection period. We kept the same management procedure in place over the entire 26-year projection because we wanted to see how that particular management procedure performed over the long term. That's what we were interested in. We weren't going to continually change management procedures from one year to the next. We wanted to see over the long term, how would that management procedure perform? The metrics that you'll see were calculated over the last 10 years of those projections. So over the last 10 years of the 26-year projection, that's what the metric is. And we use the median values as our point estimate. And these are just some of the example model outputs. So we have time series plots that look at how things changed over time over that 26-year projection period. We have box plots that give you sort of the median value along with some variability associated with those estimates, which are those 100 simulations, how variable it is. And then we have these spider plots to see how the different management procedures perform across all of these different metrics. That's a really fast review of where we are to get into the actual results. So we're going to go into the key takeaways now, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Fay to run us through some of the key takeaways initially.
Thank you, Brandon. Still hear me okay?
Yep, sound good.
Right. Well, so that was a really nice introduction to the types of output. We're going to show quite a few of the same type of information. And so I just want to take a couple of steps here to orient folks to these plots. So at the bottom of the slides, we'll have a key that indicates the, in this case, the 7 management options that were tried. So these are the management procedures, status quo, and then the ones that Brandon just walked through. Those are all going to appear on these panels in the same order. So status quo is always going to be on the left-hand side. The colors will be consistent too. And then basically each one of these panels is going to have a value for a metric for each of the management procedures. So in this case, we have consumer surplus per trip, and we have the distribution of outcomes for that particular metric for the different management procedures. In general, the higher the value of the metric, the better. So if a box or a point is towards the top of the plot, that means that that particular management procedure performed well or better than others for that particular metric. And the further down it is, the poorer it performed, or the low. So the lower the lower the value for the metric, the poorer the performance. In general, I think in terms of key takeaways, most of those alternative management procedures tended to outperform the status quo option across most of our metrics. So in general, they were able to reduce the recreational discards, provide increased harvest opportunities, and increase angler welfare. I'll return to this consumer surplus per trip here. So consumer surplus is really a proxy for welfare. It's effectively the amount an angler is willing to pay to undertake a fishing trip under a certain set of regulations. So it can be, it's basically a proxy for angler satisfaction. We can see that the minimum size option, the regional option, and the coastwide and slot limits all produced about much higher recreational satisfaction than the status quo and the seasonal option. On the left here, we have the number of the ratio of keepers to discards, keepers to releases, and this is expressed relative to MP1, so relative to the status quo. So relative to the status quo, the minimum size -1 option has, keeps twice as many fish as it discards compared to the status quo. So the higher this value, the greater the ratio of keepers to releases. This middle plot, can you go back, please? Yeah, the middle plot is the number of kept fish per trip, which is indicating, how many, on average, how many fish anglers get to take home on any given trip. And you can see that these, again, these four options here, the number of fish kept per trip relative to status quo is not quite, is almost double. And then for the slot limit option, it's about 2.5 times as many fish kept per trip. So we're broadly achieving those sort of big picture objectives. Next slide, please. Dr. Cummings will talk about this analysis more detail later, but one of the things we are also able to do is elicit preferences for for those different management objectives from our stakeholders, and so that allows us to ascribe weightings to the various different objectives in order to try to produce a score for individual management procedures. So we can, take all those metrics together, the performance of those procedures against all those metrics, given the various preferences that our stakeholders have told us is important to them, and combine those together to create a score. And so the take home here is that that status quo option on the left is the lowest overall score. The different colored bars correspond to how those four general objectives contribute to that overall score. But those alternative management procedures, have a large increase in perceived performance, and that increase is largely driven by the socioeconomics and the equity and the experience, as opposed to the stock sustainability. So the blue bar stays relatively the same across management procedures, but we see increases in the yellow and the green for those alternative management procedures. Next slide, please. That last approach really sort of tries to consolidate metrics together, but we can also look at the performance of procedures by the individual metrics, which allows us to remove that stakeholder weighting from the rankings. And this is a good way of being able to view trade-offs among metrics for management procedures. So this is either a spider plot or a kite plot. In the center of that plot, we generally see poor performance. If options are doing well against a particular metric, they are towards the outside of the plot. And so the different polygons within that metric, the different colored lines, correspond to those different management procedures. And so this allows us to look across metrics and really see whether we have trade-offs. So in this case, for the slot limit metric, you can see it's hitting the outside of the plot for the number of keepers relative to releases, the probability of keeping a fish, and the changes in consumer surplus. But it performs the worst for not overfishing. So that metric actually, that procedure actually had the worst performance of those procedures considered for that particular metric, so the highest risk of overfishing. And this allows us to sort of see things that we can't necessarily see from just looking at those plots of those individual metrics by themselves. Next slide, please. So those management procedures are generally able to improve outcomes for the recreational fishery. So the question is, well, what is the consequence of that for the stock? We were able to demonstrate that those improved recreational fishery outcomes do not really come at an expense of conservation status. So here I'm showing you again that change in consumer surplus. So you can see which management procedures are doing well in terms of angler satisfaction. None of those procedures resulted in the stock being overfished on average in that last 10 years. So that probability of not overfished is very, very high. Most of them had a very low risk of overfishing, although there was some increased risk of overfishing for some of the coastwide and slot limit options. Although it should be noted that the central tendency, even for that option that performs poorer, the central tendency for that POX plot is above 0.5, which we might typically consider as a threshold. Next slide, please. So those results were all for the base operating model scenario. So our best estimate for the universe that we're currently sitting in, but we do want to see how our choices for management perform and compared to each other and amongst things, given our major uncertainties within the system. So Brandon talked about those two alternative scenarios we ran. And I think in general, what we found was that the relative performance of management procedures remained very similar under those different operating model scenarios. So these plots are similar to the others, but instead of the box plots, we're showing a single point for each, for the median for each of the management procedures. And then the different lines and shapes of the points correspond to those different scenarios. So the circles are what we've seen before, and then the squares and the triangles are for the Emmerich biomass and the distribution shift scenarios. So if you were just looking at a single line and comparing the procedures to each other, the decision one might make is very similar, and it within an operating model scenario would be the same. The relative performance of the management procedures doesn't change, but we do notice that there is a change in performance for some of the metrics when we look at those additional scenarios. So for the distribution shift scenario on the left there, we see that angular satisfaction is reduced. And then under the Emmerich bias scenario, we have higher risks of overfishing, or lower probabilities of not overfishing for those particular management procedures that under our base scenario had slightly higher risks of overfishing. So that magnitude of risk is exacerbated under these alternative scenarios, in particular for the Emmerich bias. So the 3 at 17 and the slot scenarios there for the Emmerich bias scenario have very low probabilities of not overfishing, so very high risks of overfishing. All the results we've gone through so far have been at the stock-wide perspective, so calculating total across both the population, but also the whole recreational fishery. The recreational demand model computes things in response to regulations at the state level, so we're able to look at our performance of metrics, management procedures at the state level. When we do that, we see that there is, quite variable outcomes at the state or regional level in terms of the relative performance of management procedures. So, for example, here we have the change in the consumer surplus, the angular satisfaction again, and we can see that, depending on which state you look at, the management procedure that has performs the best or has the highest outcome changes by state. In general, we see this trend for New Jersey northwards. Our status quo and the season option tends to be the option that performs the least well or the worst. However, for the Delaware South, those options don't, they perform as well as or perhaps better than some of the other options. So depending on what is the objective for thinking about performance, there's a lot of nuance here in the results, and I think in general this is something that we perhaps need to think a bit better about how to quantify some of these impacts. But sort of thinking broad brush, we generally see improvements, but we recognize that there is variability in outcomes, and that has very important implications. Next slide. So to try and capture some of that state-by-state outcome, we also were able to think about the results and sort of develop this approach of saying, okay, how many, for a particular management procedure, how many states were the outcomes better than they would have been under status quo. So compared to status quo, how many states do we generally have a higher value for a metric than the other? So again, this is looking at the median results for each management procedure in each operating model. And the number and the plots here on the y-axis is the number of states where we do better than status quo. So that's why status quo is at 0 on the left there, because that's where it is, and we're not doing better. The status quo doesn't do better than itself. But we see that there are a couple of options that tend to do well. So min size -1 does seem to do well for most of the states across several metrics. The coastwide, the regional and coastwide metric options, including the slot limit, seem to do better than status quo for a majority of the states. But we do have some scenarios, in particular the season one and the 3 at 17 coastwide option, that didn't perform better than status quo for most of the states, or a majority of them. So this is one way, and there are a couple of other metrics which are looking at the distribution of the range of outcomes by state, which are all available on that website that Brandon shared. And this is, I think, a step towards trying to understand some of that regional variation in outcomes that we can expect for different regulation settings. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Brandon, who's going to take a dive into some additional key results. And then Dr. Carl Harrison and Dr. Cummings will talk about some of the additional results and outcomes.
Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, just those were sort of the broad sort of overview and takeaways that we've learned. Just to step through a few more slides to take a little bit of a deeper dive in regards to some of the specifics and the results that we can take away. So again, what we can see is that most management procedures resulted in an increase in the number of the fish kept, a higher percent of the trips that kept the fish, and lower numbers of discards per trip than when compared to status quo. So under status quo scenario, where you can look at the keeper to discard ratio. So under the status quo, you would keep 1 fish out of every 10 that you caught under status quo. Under some of our measures, for a majority of them, you would keep, for the most part, 2 fish for every 10 that you caught. And for some, up to 2.5, and under the slot limit, you would keep 4 fish out of every 10 that you caught. So so these procedures show that we can change sort of that dynamic in regards to the number of fish that you're able to retain for every fish that you catch. We also saw that under status quo that only 20% of the trips would produce a trip where you would be able to take home a fish. Under many of the other scenarios, we were able to move that up from anywhere from 30 to 40% of the trips that were taken, you will be able to take home a keeper fish. And we were also able to drastically change the number of keepers that you'd be able to take home per trip compared to status quo. So under status quo, you'd be able to take home about 1/4 of a fish per trip. Sounds pretty low, right? And when you're only keeping 1 out of every 10, and you're only keeping 1 out of every, only on 20% of those trips, you're only keeping 0.27 summer flounder per trip. But on many of them, we're able to double that to taking home a 1/2 fish per trip. So doubling what our existing regulations were. So across all of these ways of thinking about harvest and discards, most of these management procedures outperform status quo, and in many cases outperform status quo quite substantially. Again, and this is something that Dr. Fay had touched upon. I just wanted to look at it a little bit deeper, that it is very variable at the state specific level. So on Dr. Fay's slide, that was the consumer surplus. This is looking at the percentage of trips with a keeper fish. And again, it's really variable. So in a state like Virginia, when you look across all of the different management procedures, there's only a 6% difference between the best performing procedure and the worst performing procedure. So there isn't a whole lot of variability when you look at these things in a state like Virginia. However, when you look at a state like Connecticut, and it follows a pretty similar trend in New York and New Jersey, that there is significant differences between the best performing and the worst performing management procedure, with here the keeper per trip a 2.5 times, almost 3 times difference between the worst performing versus the best performing. So there's a big range. And then even within the northern region, where the trends are generally look very similar, in a state like Massachusetts, you see a slightly different pattern where compared to some of the other regions. So where management procedure number 2, which is the one where you just drop the minimum size by 1 inch across all states, that performed much better in Massachusetts than it did in a state like Connecticut or Rhode Island or New Jersey. So even though the scale, the range of difference between worst performing and best performing in Massachusetts was very similar, 2.5 times better between those differences, which procedures performed better or worse are different in a state like Massachusetts and others. So there's a lot of variability between when you look at it at a very state-specific level. We also looked at things a little bit differently that were interested by the core group. These weren't specific metrics, at least the mean keeper length, but we wanted to evaluate how these different management procedures impact removals. And obviously the figure on the left-hand side there is looking at the mean size of a kept fish. And so under the status quo, the size of our current fish is just over 20 inches. And under most management procedures, we're able to bring down that minimum size mostly to about 18.5 inches to 18 inches under management procedure number 7, and down to 17 inches under management procedure number 8. Those 2 slot limit options brought the size limit down the most. And a number of our core group participants were also interested in the ability to retain a trophy fish. And so we also looked at that. And you can see that as you lower the minimum size, the number of trips that retain a trophy fish also goes down. And you can see under the slot limit, obviously there are no trophy fish being kept, because a trophy fish we define here is anything greater than 28 inches under that true slot limit. The maximum size limit is 20 inches, so you couldn't keep any trophy fish. I would point out, even under status quo, only 2% of all trips keep a trophy fish now, and goes down to anywhere down to 1% to less than 1% of the trips under these different options would keep a trophy fish. And there's a lot going on this slide, but again, this is looking at things across the different operating models here. So the risk of overfishing, of the stock becoming overfished, is very low across all of these different management procedures. Spawning stock biomass did decrease compared to the status quo. That's the lower left-hand figure there when we look at spawning stock biomass compared to the status quo options. So total spawning stock biomass actually does go down for a number of our management procedures. But again, the stock does not, these simulations show that the stock does not become overfished under any condition, but we do have that greater risk of overfishing on some of these options, particularly the true slot limit option. There's some increased risk in that coast-wide 17-inch option. Again, those are higher risk under that MRIP bias runs, but so there is a little bit of additional risk. We also we had a sex-specific model here that we are allowed to evaluate the proportion of females within the recreational harvest. And so currently under status quo options, about 67% of the recreational harvest is females. And by changing the minimum size, by reducing the minimum size, we're actually able to reduce the amount of females being removed in the population. Only the slot limit, management procedure number 8, is the only one that brought it down below 50%. So all of the options, we'd still be harvesting more females than males under any of these options. But as I noted in the briefing book materials, as you can see in that slide right next to it, those options that reduce the amount of female harvest actually didn't increase the amount of spawning stock biomass in the population. So we're removing more fish at a smaller size and not allowing those fish to grow to larger sizes. We're removing more males out of the population, which have been contributing to the spawning stock biomass more in recent years. And so you don't see, even though we are reducing the amount of female harvest, it's not translating into increased spawning stock biomass under those options. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lou to talk about some of the consumer surplus and economic outcomes. Go ahead, Lou.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me all right?
Sound good?
Hi, yeah, this is Luke Harris at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. So I helped develop the recreational demand model. I gave a detailed overview in the last council meeting, but I've also provided details in the technical write-up, and you could also ask me questions. So the rec demand model allowed us to estimate social and economic benefits across the different management procedures. So here we've plotted the two main socioeconomic metrics. On the left is the change in consumer surplus per trip, which is the maximum amount of money an angler would be willing to pay to fish under one of these scenarios relative to a baseline 2019 scenario. Or you can think of it as the value of satisfaction in dollar terms derived, additional satisfaction derived from these different management scenarios. And on the right, we have the number of trips expected to occur relative to the management scenario one, or the status quo scenario. These metrics were both derived from the same set of behavioral parameters, so they both follow similar trends. And these are at the coastwide level. And as we saw, they are more variable at the state level. But in general, consumer surplus and number of trips increase with policies that increase the number of fish harvested per trip. And this is because our behavioral model results tell us that expected summer fluke harvest is the key determinant of angler satisfaction. So as anglers encounter and are able to keep more legal size fish, then we'll see increases in welfare and the number of trips. Looking across the scenarios, we see that status quo and the season regulations produce the lowest level of welfare. The season regulation shortened the season in some states and expanded the season in other states, and those effects largely canceled out. So there was not much change in welfare relative to the status quo. Four of the other management alternatives resulted in a roughly 3 times increase in angler welfare relative to status quo. And then the pure slot option on the right led to about a 4 times increase in angler welfare relative to the status quo. And these plots are important because they allow us to kind of look at the trade-offs or quantitatively evaluate the trade-offs anglers are willing to make between the size and the number of fish kept under a given policy scenario. So if we look at, say, the green and the yellow, these are 2 of the coastal regulations. They produce roughly the same amount of welfare and induce the same number of expected fishing trips for summer flounder. So this tells us that anglers are willing to trade off a higher bag limit with a higher minimum size limit for lower bag limit with lower minimum size limits. And so we see, being able to look at the economic and behavioral impacts of these regulations and then compare them to the biological impacts gives us kind of a broader story of how regulations affect the fishery. Next slide, please. We also looked at total trip expenditures induced by the various policies. Total trip expenditures are the direct spending by anglers on their trip, summed across the region. So these trip expenditures can be thought of as an indicator for impacts to downstream businesses. So as anglers spend money in support of their trip, these expenses filter through the economy through secondary spending from retail, from wholesalers and manufacturers and so on. And they generate jobs and sales and GDP. We can actually calculate those other economic metrics, but because they are linearly related to expenditures at the state level, we kind of just focused on looking at total trip expenditures. So we calculated the trip expenditures by multiplying the average trip expense based on recent marine angler expenditure survey data to the total number of trips at the state level. So these trip expenditures closely follow the results from the previous slide in terms of the total number of trips. So we found that the status quo policy resulted in the lowest trip expenditures at about 471 million, which is similar to the trip expenditures induced by directed summer flounder fishing in 2019. The minimum size -1, the regional regulations, and the 3 fish at 17-inch minimum size limit policies resulted in a roughly 5% increase in trip expenditures relative to the status quo. In second place in terms of trip expenditures was the modified slot limit. So 1 fish 16 to 19 and 2 longer than 19, which resulted in roughly $500 million in trip expenditures. And again, mirroring the results in terms of coast-wide welfare and trips, the pure slot limit resulted in the highest trip expenditures at about 513 million, or a 9% increase compared to management strategy 1 or the status quo. Next slide. Okay, yeah, I think this is someone else is presenting this. I think I forget who, but
Yep.
Yeah, so hi, Dr. Jonathan Cummings. I was the consultant on this project and helped with the facilitation of the stakeholder engagement portions. I'm going to dig in a little bit more on the trade-off analysis and preferences that we elicited from the stakeholders here. So again, to examine the trade-offs among metrics and procedures, we asked core group members to provide their preferences, and they're captured through weights assigned to those management objectives. So what you're seeing in the figure here is how important, so the relative degree of importance of each of the 4 main objectives for this management strategy evaluation. So angler experience quality, equity of angler experience, stock sustainability, and the socioeconomic objectives. And then the higher up on this figure, any of the portions of those box plots are, the more important the core group members, the stakeholders, were saying that particular objective was. So the stock sustainability and the quality of the angler experience quality were higher priorities for the stakeholders, with equity of angler experience also fairly important, but coming in lower, and then the socioeconomic was the lowest weighted one. Note that they're fairly similar overall, so if a 25 would be equal weighting across the 4. So stock sustainability is more in sort of the median there, about 30, and socioeconomic coming in more about 17 at the median. And you'll note here also that there's some variability across the stakeholders that was captured as well. So we used the median, was what was shown in the key findings before, but I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about the variability in the stakeholders and how that played out. So the relative ranking of the management procedures was consistent across the range of relative importance placed on each objective by the stakeholders. So the figure here is what you saw before that Dr. Fay presented. And the reason that I stuck it in here again is essentially, while the absolute numbers at the top of any of those bars may differ, and how much contribution any of the colors is making to that total changes based upon the stakeholder preferences for any individual stakeholder, what their preference was, the overall relative scores there stayed fairly consistent. And so the overall ranking of the procedures that we evaluated was pretty consistent and robust to the stakeholder preferences. So SLOT had the highest score across the weighting schemes, and again, was robust to that range of stakeholder preferences, always ranking best. The relative ranking of the other procedures was similar across those stakeholder preferences. And in all situations, all of the other procedures were higher than the status quo. And just one final comment related to the weights that were shown on that previous slide. This procedure or this technique, the reason to go into this trade-off weighting, in addition to getting a total score or combining the metrics to get a total score for the management procedures here. Also, these weights can then be used to carry forward this analysis to additional management procedures if there's proposed. So we've stored these preference scores, and so any new procedure could be evaluated using those preference scores going forward. So in addition to the inclusion of the recreational demand model that Lou offered as one of the kind of key new things that we feel like this management strategy evaluation offered, this trade-off analysis is another kind of step forward for the way that we can think about decision-making for regulations. And I've got some bonus slides on any of this if you have questions later on, but otherwise I'll turn it back over to Brandon.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So just a couple more slides. It's been long. There's a lot of information to go through. So just sort of wrapping it up. I did want to present, right, this is our first time going through this kind of management strategy evaluation with the council. And so we wanted to make sure we got feedback from the core group in terms of what they thought about the process. Was it valuable? They spent a lot of time through 5 workshops, and we had homework for them to do in between workshops. And so it was a lot of commitment for them, and they stuck with it, thankfully. And so we wanted to get a sense from them how valuable it was and what could we learn from them in regards to if we were to do a management strategy evaluation going forward. And so they identified a lot of different positives. They think that the outcomes that we've presented here are valuable for management. They think they are supported, that these outcomes are supported by the science and by the models that we've created here. It allowed them to think outside the box. Instead of how we traditionally think about recreational management, they indicated they learned a lot about recreational fisheries and management. So we talked about these concepts and ideas a lot differently than we traditionally do, and they like that. They also like the diverse membership that we've had. We had some new people that I've never known before. So we had some new faces to get some different perspectives within the group, and everybody was really, and they liked that everybody was encouraged to participate, and everybody certainly provided their input. Nobody was quiet on the group, which was great. And they also identified areas that we could improve on things as well. They thought some of the components were very technical. I mean, we talked a lot about models during all of these meetings, and maybe we got down into the weeds a little bit too much at times. And they also thought certainly in the beginning that we moved a little bit slow. They thought that some of the ideas, we tried to stay very focused. We had a very clear directive from the council and board to focus on recreational discards. But people also wanted to talk about other ideas like allocations and other things. And we tried to pull people back to this particular focus, but they felt by not exploring some of these other issues that they felt limited in terms of the discussion and the ideas that we could come up with. There are certainly concerns about the data that we used in the models, and therefore, if you're concerned about the data going into the model, you have some concerns about and the uncertainty in the results. And some folks felt that the outcomes really won't help the recreational community. But I would say most of the feedback was that the results are very beneficial and can help management. And so to me, there's also some additional applications. I've already received a couple of phone calls from other research projects that are interested in the results of this and are actually picking up research based off of what we've done here. Virginia Tech University is actually doing some work right now that's going to sort of expand upon and build upon some of the work that we've done here. There is the potential to build upon our other recreational fisheries and other council priorities. I think we have a strong modeling framework here and simulation framework here to build upon other areas. I think we set ourselves up well with the system that we created here to work on other areas. And so that leads me here in terms of the application of how we can use this. This is really novel in terms of what we've created here in terms of integrating a population dynamics model with this recreational demand model and understanding how angler behavior responds to changing regulations and availability of fish off of Massachusetts versus Delaware. And so I think it's really neat to see what we've created. We've created we addressed the task that the council and board put before us to identify strategies that reduce discards, increase harvest opportunities without negatively impacting the stock. And so I think we've been really successful with what we've been able to do here. And so this management strategy evaluation, I think this will be important on our next slide, which is the last slide, to think about the council and board feedback. So this management strategy evaluation is really thinking about strategic information, right? We evaluated this over the long term, how these management procedures perform over 26 years, and we only looked at it compared to an ABC. We did not evaluate these metrics specifically to an RHL or to an ACL. We were looking at the broader implications of a particular management strategy evaluation. And so I think we've helped identify strategies that you all may be interested in, sort of either stopping and not being interested in, or management strategies that you are interested in pursuing further, based off of the objectives that you all think are a priority. So we have that strategic information that the management strategy evaluation provided. Within that, we've created models that can give us tactical advice. That recreational demand model can estimate what we think harvest and what we think discards will be in the following year based off of what the stock conditions are and what regulations might be. We can actually make predictions in regards to what we think harvest will be in the next year. And we can evaluate that then to an RHL or to an ACL. So we've created a system where we've given you strategic information to evaluate different objectives. And then we also have models now that can give you tactical advice in regards to what you want to do in out years. And so given all of that, where do we want to go with that? So we have some very specific next steps that we need to do. So based off of some feedback that you all provide today, we have the ability to do some limited updates and model runs, right? Where we've essentially done the management strategy evaluation, but if there's something completely missing from what we've done here, and again, we're going to get some broad feedback from you all in regards to where we want to go with some of these management procedures. But so there are some opportunities to do some limited updated runs. We need to finish the final report. We wanted to wait to get feedback from you all today before we finish it. You have the final results. That final report would just go into more of the details in regards to our work with the core group and how we got to the results that we did. We plan to update that recreational demand model with the 2022 choice experiment information. So what's in there now is a survey that was done in 2010. That's what's setting our choice experiment, our angler choice preferences are from a 2010 survey. It was updated in 2022. And I know Dr. Carr-Harris is already waiting and to get that raw information to update that model with the survey from 2022. So we need to do that. And then how do we want to integrate that information into potentially setting 2023 management specifications and sort of the integration with the harvest control rule. And that's some of the discussion we're going to have here with the council and board. So thinking about all of that, what we're looking for is getting a general direction on the management procedures to develop. So do you not want to consider slot limit options or not consider coast-wide options, or are those ones that you prefer? So give us, the technical work group, some general direction in regard. We don't need to get into specifics that we need 3 fish at this size limit for this particular state, but to say we do or we don't like these kinds of management procedures to think about for 2023 or the future for summer flounder specifically. And if you have management procedures that you're interested in, what are the priority objectives that we're trying to achieve? Are we trying to get equity across states? Are we trying to achieve the angler experience and be able to take home additional fish? Because that'll change the kind of management procedures that we're interested in, right? So thinking about what those key priority objectives are that we should focus in on. Again, so we only have this management strategy evaluation and thinking about this for only summer flounder, but we could utilize the models themselves within that for our other recreational species. And so therefore, do you want us to be thinking about utilizing utilizing the models for 2023 to inform recreation, to inform specs in 2023 or sometime later? So again, so we have these two different levels, the outcomes from the management strategy evaluation that give us some general guidance for management procedures that we want to think about specific to summer flounder. And then we have the models within them, particularly the recreational demand model. We have another model developed by Dr. McNamee here that'll be thinking about how we actually implement things in 2023. So there are two different layers to what we did through this management strategy evaluation. And so with all of that, an hour and a half of talking, I'll open it up to questions and feedback and have a discussion from you all in terms of where we want to go with the management strategy evaluation. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. And Gavin, Lou, John, thanks for all your work and your presentation today. There's certainly a tremendous amount of work that's gone behind what was presented before us this morning. And I know that there will be some questions. We have about a half an hour on the agenda. And as Brandon mentioned, there are some things that we certainly want to provide feedback on about the use of this management strategy evaluation and potential it has for 2023 measures and beyond. So before we get to that feedback, I'd like to start with questions. And I'm going to look to the screen. So I have Joe Cimino and then Jason McNamee. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all the presenters. Brandon, there was a slide that Gavin had that that had the results of the different runs. And I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit with how the MRIP bias performance, Mike told me to speak to the mic, in regards to overfishing. And I'm struggling, trying to understand. Obviously, none of these seem terribly risky, but just what does that risk mean, and how does it play into the fact that, you were making an assumption that we're not course correcting, that the regs are staying in place. Does that even play in? I was kind of struggling with that plot.
Gavin, do you want me to take that or at least try and then you can follow up?
Go for it.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, some of the information is a little bit maybe counterintuitive and thinking about the MRIP bias sort of information, right? So what we saw there primarily was the implications of utilizing that lower bound as our estimate instead of the point estimate was that it increased risk to most of the management procedures and in some cases quite a bit. And so, when we do that, there are implications not only in the recreational demand model and thinking about how many trips may be taken, but it also impacts the actual stock dynamics as well. So just as when we changed and added the new MRIP estimates a few years ago, where we all of a sudden realized recreational harvest was more than we thought it was. And so what did that do? That increased our understanding of stock productivity. The population sizes went up than what we had originally anticipated. So when you use the lower bound and taking fewer trips and lower harvest, we're also then changing what we think about stock productivity again in the other way. And so now under some of those scenarios, you're inducing a little bit more risk under those lower productivity scenarios, given the change in how we think the stock responds to those. So it's a little bit different than what you think, but there's sort of this relationship between removals and how the stock responds and what overall stock productivity is.
All right, thanks, Brandon. Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just this is super, super exciting. You know, awesome work. Nice job getting what I imagine is an even more enormous amount of information into a kind of concise presentation. So just well done to the whole group. Super excited to see this work. So to my question, you know, and this was, it caught me off guard. I would have never, this is why we do this, right? The crashing the airplane picture. But that, you know, the slot limit, I'm sure caught everyone's eye, certainly caught my eye. It kind of outperforms almost across the board, except for the one trade-off, and that is the risk of overfishing. And so that's where my question is focused. So it must, I'm guessing the case is that it triggers overfishing with some frequency that's higher than the other procedures, but not enough to impact the overall the status of the stock, the size of the population. And so my question is, you know, how frequently, and is it like a series of years together? I'm wondering if you guys kind of dove in that deep. And then I'll end with a comment to say, this would be an important thing to think about in the context of MSA and how we might use something like this, which clearly seems like this type of procedure should be something we're using, but in the confines of MSA, can it work if in fact we do want to use something like that? So thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks. And Stephen, I may need your help because I can't seem to advance the slides. We actually have a slide specifically to your point, and Gavin, I'll let you speak to Jay's question in regards to the slot option and the overfishing and not overfished. So Stephen, if you can advance the slides. Yep, keep going. I'll tell you when to stop. Right there, back one. Right there. So Gavin, do you want to speak to this?
Sure, I can do that. Thanks for teeing us up, Jay. I think both questions actually we've had are sort of related here. In addition to Brandon's response about the change to the understanding of underlying stock dynamics with the MRIP bias scenario, we do have course correction in the management advice in the fact that we are changing ABCs over the duration of the scenario, and you know, in response to perceptions about stock size, and that also impacts the recreational harvest, because as the fluke population goes up and down, the expected catch per trip, which is used in the recreational demand model, is also modified. So if there's more fluke available, then the expected catch per trip will be higher. So in general, you know, you do see that tracking of harvest with stock size. For this particular question that Jason was interested in, here I've just sort of separated out the status quo, which is MP1 here, and the slot limit option, which is denoted MP8. I apologize for the difference in nomenclature. But then, you know, this is broken out a little bit more in terms of the simulation trajectories, or the distribution of the simulation trajectories. For the status of the stock relative to B, the reference, so B over BMSY and F over FMSY. And so what you can see on the left there is that there is an effect of the slot limit on the expectation for spawning biomass, and we are fishing harder under that scenario. So that interval, that peachy red colored interval on the right, is substantially higher than the green one under status quo in terms of the magnitude of F relative to FMSY, but it's not egregiously higher. So it's, you know, it's not 2 or 3 times FMSY, and so that's why you don't see on average the reduction of the biomass below our kind of overfished threshold. on 10. Now, there are some simulations where you do see some go down, but in terms of the expectation is not there on average. So those individual lines, which are kind of hard to see, represent individual simulations. So you can see that there's some variability in outcomes, but in terms of the sort of long-term average metrics, we don't, although we are fishing harder under MBA, we're not fishing hard enough to really increase risk to the stock, as from a perspective of reducing biomass below the limit reference.
All right, thank you for that. John Maniscalco, you're up. John Clark, you're after the other John. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Same thing that caught Jay McNamee's eye caught mine as well. And before I go on, actually, I did want to also extend my thanks to everyone who participated in this, all the technical staff, but also all those stakeholders that stayed engaged. And I was wondering if Garfo would be willing to make any comments about the potential for overfishing that comes with that slot limit. Thank you.
Sarah.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful. I'm not really clear what the question is in terms of just making comments. Could you clarify?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, John, either you can or I can. It's your question, so maybe you can give it a shot.
I will give it a go. I mean, it is a little vague, and I apologize for that, but I just can't. I see this potentially incredibly attractive option that seems to give many states access to the fishery, but there's an increased chance of overfishing, um, and that's not something we can usually ignore. And I was just wondering, Garfo having seen these same outputs, what do they think when they may be asked by the council, for example, to consider a coastwide slot limit that has a significantly higher chance of overfishing as a regulation? I don't know if that helps you understand what I'm asking.
Sarah.
Sure, I can try. A couple things. One, the model runs, within the model runs, they never change the measures in response to the changing ABCs. So in reality, when we're setting management measures, we likely wouldn't keep the measures the same, right, for 26 years. And with respect to the overfishing, if I'm following your question, I think the other thing that's important to remember is still when you're reviewing and evaluating management measures, you're still looking at the probability of overfishing and still setting it in a way that you have at least a 50% chance of success. And that doesn't change when you're going through your annual management measures and evaluating them and setting them. Did you have a follow-up question maybe after that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, if I can. So I guess my question might go back to Gavin. Maybe if he could help us understand a little bit better just how much greater the probability of overfishing is for the slot limit, maybe relative to that middle band of options. I think there was like 2, 4, 6, and 7 that all seem to have a lower chance of lower probability of overfishing. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think I think the results suggest that that there are very low probabilities of overfishing, but that those risks of overfishing are sensitive to key uncertainties. And so those different operating model scenarios are a way of saying, how robust might our decision making be? We considered 2 alternatives based on kind of the dimensions of uncertainty that were highlighted specifically by our stakeholder group. I think that the results that we had, the simulation results, if you were using those probabilities. And I think they're, as Sarah just articulated, the metrics, the operating model metrics here are not the same as the probability of overfishing that would be used in a sort of specification setting sequence. It's not quite the same thing. But the results for that Emirate bias scenario would be, you would suggest that scenario does not, it does not meet the objective of overfishing less than 50% of the time. So that's, those numbers on those plots, you could see those as the probabilities of the stock of overfishing occurring under those scenarios for the way that was defined in this simulation. So how many times in the last 10 years does is the F greater than FMSY? So I mean, if you were going to use that number, then you might make statements regarding that it doesn't satisfy, that those options, say the salt limits and stuff, don't satisfy the goals given that particular set of uncertainties. Now, and I think, there are other plausible options, but what this does allow us to do, and I think the strength of this analysis is think about relative performance. And then I think that's what I would encourage is sort of thinking about, relative performance amongst different options and where those trade-offs are. But I recognize that also is there's a minimum standard that also needs to be met.
Okay, thanks for that. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Brandon, and the presenters. This is really, and everybody who worked on this is really amazing stuff. Very interesting. Just hopefully easy question and a clarification. I was wondering, on the option that was the status quo -1 inch, you made the minimum 16 inches, where for the Delaware South region, the minimum size, if you subtracted an inch, would have been 15.5 inches. Was there a reason for limiting it to 16 inches?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, the general census within the group, and we had that one option that looked at that 14-inch minimum size just to align things with the commercial size limit. But the general sense in talking to the core stakeholder group was that a minimum size of 16 inches was sufficient across the states to get down to. So as you had indicated at the time, Delaware did not, and the state south had a 16.5 inch minimum size. So the thinking was just to get down to 16 inches, not go below that most people were satisfied with going down to 16 inches, and that would satisfy most states, most modes. If you were to go down to 16 inches for a shore mode, for example, that would satisfy most folks. So we didn't entertain anything below 16.
Oh, thanks, Brandon. I'm just curious because when you go to the state by state satisfaction, obviously, as we saw, the further south we went, the less appealing some of those options were that were already kind of where we are. And that just ties in. The way these were done is unlike the way we actually did like the regional process. Delaware, Maryland, Virginia were pooling what our allocations of the recreational quota would be. And so, that worked out well for Delaware. We were able to match the other states. But for these options, just to be clear, you are actually taking the entire recreational allocation and you're not divvying up by state. It's like these options would be every state would be just taking from the same allocation, the overall allocation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. Kate Wilkie.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My question is along the similar lines to the previous questions. Brandon, or I saw several slides that said for the most part the tested management procedures don't result in overfishing other than possibly the slot limit. Can you help me understand if you had a slide that showed we're keeping more fish for every 10 that are caught under these different scenarios. So can you help me understand how does that prevent overfishing? Is there some other measure that's changed to even it out, or are there fewer trips taken? Do fewer fish die from discard mortality? Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, so I think it's an interaction between all of those things, right? So in many cases, so under some of those like that dual slot or even the full slot or many of the options, we reduce the possession limit. So down to 3 fish for many of those. So we're reducing the possession limit, we're reducing the season for some of those states. So, and we are then converting some of those fish that would have been discarded, we are now converting them into harvest. And so you are losing fewer fish to discards overall. So I think it's sort of the intersection of all of those things, Kate, that sort of are sort of interacting together, which was nice to be able to evaluate all of those things together in terms of how they can control overall fishing mortality on the recreational side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon.
All right, thanks, Kate. All right, I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then we're going to turn things to some discussion. I'm going to go next to Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just echo all of the kudos that have gone before with respect to this effort and everything that's been put into it and everything that's coming out of it, and especially to everyone who participated as part of that core stakeholder group. You know, I know this was a lot of time and effort. So one thing I'm still a little bit confused about, and I apologize because you reviewed this and it was just a little bit hard for me to hear, but the evaluating the trade-offs among the outputs. So I understand that the core stakeholder group, you know, sort of ranked these 4 different objectives. And so that produced weightings, but I'm still not maybe entirely clear about how those weightings were applied across the different management procedures. Did the core stakeholder group then, I mean, I'm just going to shut up and let you tell me how that was done. How about that?
Sounds good, Michelle. Go ahead,
So
Brandon.
I'll try to answer, and then Jonathan, if I'm not answering it correctly, can jump in. So they are weighting 2 different parts, the core stakeholder group. So they're not weighting the actual management procedures, right? We have the results of the management procedure. So they are weighting each metric. So how important is each metric to them? So is it more important to retain a fish on a particular trip versus being able to keep a trophy fish? So they are ranking those or weighting those individually. And then they are also weighting how important each of those overall objectives are. And so you combine those 2 scores and then you compare them to the outputs of each management procedure to get the overall score, right? So we know how, so if and I'm just using this as an example, if the core group says keeping home a fish is the most important thing to them, we have how each metric performs at keeping a fish on, you know, so therefore that management procedure that performs best under keeping a fish on a particular trip then gets ranked, gets weighted heavier. Do you understand what I mean? So the core group is weighting how important each of those metrics are to them and how important each of those objectives are to them. So then those scores get ranked and then we can evaluate, then they're sort of crosswalked to the outcomes of each management procedure compared to that metric.
Thank you. That helps.
So yeah, if that covers it, feel free to move on. If you want more, I do have 2 slides that go through the process I can walk you through, but I know you're tight on time, so up to you.
Yeah, I think we're gonna move on from that. Michelle seems comfortable with the answer that Brandon provided. So thanks for that offer, though. Adam Nowalski, you're next.
Thank you very much. We've had a lot of conversation around this table about what we believe would be benefits to the stock by leaving more females in the water. Not only has that conversation been had around the table, but in APs, a lot of different scientific venues as well. So we have this information in front of us using the data and the modeling that was available that presented that despite leaving more females in the water, we wouldn't see an increase in SSB as a result of that. And then we also have these concerns that have taken up a lot of our discussion and questions so far about the increase in risk of overfishing. Now, mind you, we're not talking about exceeding the 50% number that we typically work with, but it's an increased risk with other options. My question is, what are the limitations that we have with regards to assessment work that would incorporate variables such as spawning potential that may not be capturing the true benefit of leaving those females in the water? And if we did have that information as assessments improved, that would change what we're seeing with regards to our concerns about increased chance of overfishing, as well as potentially changing what we see as a reaction with the SSB.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the most qualified to specifically answer that. Like I said, I think the outcomes that we've shown here have been consistent with some previous management strategy evaluation work that was done by John Wiedemann and Mike Wilberg, specifically on summer flounder, that in regards to how we may be changing recreational management and sort of the outcomes to SSB. And I know a lot of work has been done within the stock assessment process to evaluate sort of the changing sex ratios within the population. Again, SSB, the way we define it now through the stock assessment, is both mature males and females. So it's not just females there. So, you know, maybe there are ways to quantify things differently, right? So a 14-inch female has a different fecundity versus a 24-inch female. I don't think we are capturing that, although Mark can, I think I saw Mark's name on the webinar. So I don't know what's kind of information or how we need to specify things differently within for SSB and within the stock assessment process to get us more at that particular issue, Adam. And I don't know if Gavin or Mark have any additional comments. I don't know what to specifically offer in terms of what we would need to get at a more refined SSB than what we currently do now.
Adam.
So let me just try to simplify the question then. Without those specifics, is it reasonable to believe advancements in assessment work in the future with spawning potential could give us a different picture about what the effect of leaving the females in the water will actually be?
Sure. I mean, I certainly think if we have some additional information regarding that, I think yes. And so I think that would be valuable. The other point that I would make as I was thinking about it, right? We currently, the stock assessment and within our modeling framework, there is no sort of feedback between spawning stock biomass and recruitment. That we don't see a relationship between SSB and recruitment. So there isn't this feedback loop between if you increase SSB that you are going to see a change in recruitment patterns. And so there isn't this immediate sort of feedback relationship. So if we have some more detailed information about spawning stock biomass and what those implications may mean for recruitment and egg productivity and egg viability and all of those sorts of things, I certainly think it would be helpful, yes, for both the assessment and for something like this.
Okay, thanks for that. I have two more hands from the council and the board. I'm going to take those as far as questions, and then we're going to turn this into a discussion. We'll start with Dewey.
I'm probably going to get myself in the weeds about asking about this, but this this modeling that's done in this exercise is with basically looking at angler satisfaction and what the angler wants about catching more fish. Is that correct? Or how happy they are with their experience of catching hopefully more fish. All right, so that's the exercise there. Is there any exercise that can be included in the future, and it's based on MRIP numbers of how this kind of works? And is there anything in the future that can be based on like weather conditions to where that fisherman didn't go fishing, so he didn't have a satisfaction of catching fish? And also based on your price of fuel, I believe I was shown that it was 2020, the price of fuel was half of what it was, less half than what it is now. And how does that play into their satisfaction of whether they go fishing or not? And if they're out there catching 9 fish and only keeping 1, they might be would burning more fuel and they would not go fishing. I think my question is, what I'm asking is maybe further along something that could be implemented in this model possibility as time is developed versus what this has now, which is pretty interesting. But I'm always leery of models because it's like fixing a tank on a boat that's had a hole in it and you weld it, but you got to pressure test it. Reality to see if that hole is fixed or not. And so it's very interesting and promising here, but that's just 2 things I wonder about in the future. Weather conditions, because there's a certain factor where these anglers are not going to go fishing in certain areas at certain times, and so they won't be satisfied. And also the price of fuel that's going to be used, that's doubled right now, that some folks aren't able to afford it. Or at what price does the angler not be able to afford to go fishing because they don't have enough expendable income to go do that fishery? Thank you.
I think I can.
No, I was gonna turn it over to Lou to answer that. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So you make great points. I mean, weather and the impacts of climate change is certainly going to have it's certainly going to impact anglers' decision to go fishing, and there's some research in that area. The current model doesn't take into consideration the effect of weather variability on anglers' choices to go fishing. So the survey data that we're using just didn't include weather as a feature of the trip. So we essentially model anglers' fishing decision as a function of their expected catch and the trip cost. In terms of trip costs, we use the most recent angler expenditure survey data from 2017 to calculate, an expected trip cost, and we hold those constant throughout the time series. So, I mean, in the future, we certainly could tweak the prices that get input into the model to reflect, changing gas prices. But right now, we haven't considered that.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to go next to co-chair Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a question for commission and council staff, and I might be jumping the gun here. So if I am, feel free to say we'll put a pin in it and come back to it. My question has to do with recreational measure setting for 2023. I'm really excited about these modeling tools that have been developed that I think can hopefully get us out of this box we've been in, where we've had to assume that past performance is going to be indicative of future returns. That observations of fishery performance under some set of availability and regulations is going to be a good predictor of what might happen in the future. So I'd like to see us get to a place where we could use these modeling tools as soon as possible. I know our measure setting process for this year is going to be different than in the past because of the interim implementation of the harvest control rule, but I think ultimately, once we get through the decision process that's part of that harvest control rule, and if it doesn't recommend status quo measures, we're still ultimately going to have to craft some recreational measures that either achieve the reduction or liberalization we're looking for. So my question is, are these tools essentially tools in the toolbox now that the technical folks could use in crafting those potential regulations, absent some direction from the board or council today otherwise?
Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
So there's a few things to me. So for summer flounder, right, we have some additional information as part of the management strategy evaluation here, right? So even if as part of the harvest control rule process, it states that we don't need to liberalize or take reductions for summer flounder. To me, I think this modeling approach, this management strategy evaluation says we could maybe look at other alternatives that perform even under a status quo situation, that we could look at other things, right? So that's one point very specific to summer flounder through the management strategy evaluation. Number two, in regards to specifications for 2023, I think the models, particularly like Lou's recreational demand model and Dr. McNamee's model, I think they are ready for use to look at different management measures and make estimates of what we think catch and harvest will be in 2023 under a set of recreational management measures for some species, right? So the recreational demand model, and Luke can speak to it better than I can. It's ready, clearly ready for summer flounder. We've run it here. Lou has spent a lot of time working on it for black sea bass. But I don't think at this stage, and maybe it'll change once we get the new 2022 angler, discrete choice experiment information, maybe it could use for scup, but so this tool is ready now. Yes, it is part of the tool in the toolbox, and I think Jay's model is a tool in the toolbox as well, and I think can be also used for scup, correct, Jay? So we have these tools immediately available. So they are tools, and so again, I think we just have some additional tools or some additional things to consider for summer flounder that we don't have maybe for some of the other species, but I think they're ready to go in general for 2023.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think that is a perfect segue into kind of where we need to go with this, which is a discussion about the application of this tool along with the harvest control rule in, what the council and the board's direction and advice would be to staff about preparing for measure setting for 2023. So there are a few folks, I think, from the public that had some either comment or questions. I'm going to hold off at this point and try to focus the discussion to the council and the board, but there will be opportunity before we conclude this section of the agenda from this morning to address questions and thoughts and comments from the public. I wonder, Brandon, if you could go back a slide. I think you had kind of a wrap-up slide that had a few points on it that would help maintain a focus. I took a few notes, and the things that I jotted down had to do with whether or not we want to keep or discard any of the alternative options that were analyzed. And then I guess the exclamation point is, are we ready to provide the advice to staff about using this tool for 2023? And how does that fold itself into using the harvest control rule as well? So I'll stop there and see if folks have thoughts for staff on the next steps. Start with Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just, as far as kind of the first question, I mean, maybe I'll start with the general comment of we should absolutely use this information, to kind of think about our management for summer flounder, as soon as possible. I think there was some really interesting information that came before us. And so in that context, I would say, really a lot of the things that were in there are things we kind of look at already, with the exception of the slot limit options. And so adding that at least into the mix, I think is super important. Moving on to other species, you know, again, I don't, it's not a simple thing, but absolutely we should, progress, develop this tool for the other species that we kind of talk about with this group. Probably black sea bass next, scup after that, and bluefish to kind of follow on after that, just to put a sequence to it. And then one comment that I wanted to make with regard to the model that I've been working on with Corinne Truesdale from Rhode Island. So it works except in the case of slot limits. So it kind of takes that tool out of the toolbox. And just to give you an explanation as to why, the model that Corinne and I are working on, it's conditioned on past data. And so there is no past data with a slot limit. So it kind of, I can get creative. You know that already. I could come up with something, but I don't know that we'd want to get, we're already creative. So maybe something we need to think about, but I think it hinders the use of the tool that we're working on if slot limits come into the mix, but I think they should come into the mix. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that. Kate Wilkie, you're next, and then on deck will be Michelle. Go ahead, Kate.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is a really interesting and cutting edge tool. And I'm definitely interested in seeing further looking into how it can be used in relation to the harvest control rule. I do have some concern about sector allocation. The council just spent time on a reallocation amendment between commercial and recreational. And I heard Brandon say that these strategies were evaluated by comparing with an ABC. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to incorporate sector allocation into this tool, or how you see that playing out. Thanks.
Brandon?
Kate, by sector allocation, do you mean sector allocation within the recreational fishery?
I mean, commercial versus
I
recreation.
see. Yeah, so so in this, we modeled and incorporated the commercial fleet as well, right? So when we produce those fishing mortality estimates of what comes out, that includes both the recreational removals and the commercial removals. So we are taking the ABC, we are allocating it based off of the changes to the commercial and recreational allocations that the council and board recently approved, and then allocating that. So you could utilize this tool to look at changes in allocations and look at what those implications are. We were very explicit because there was interest by core group members to look at that, but we did not want to go down that road of looking. We wanted to be very focused on what we were doing, and the council and board were handling allocations separately from this process. And so we wanted that process to go through the work. And so we didn't really want to confound the issues, but this could be utilized to look at those things for sure, if there was interested in doing that.
So just to clarify, the current allocation schemes were incorporated into the model. Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks, Kate. Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to express my support for, let's use the tool, and I would love to see it used during the 2023 spec setting process. But I mean, and it sounds like, based on the slide and what Dr. Carr-Harris said, that, updating that recreational demand model with the results of the 2022 experiment outputs is high priority. Because I mean, that would be the one thing that I would want incorporated in there. I don't know if there's any sense right now, what the differences are between the 2010 survey and the results that are coming in from the 2022 survey, but I would think we would want to be as accurate as possible, just thinking about what the what the world situation was like back in 2010 versus, 2022 and how rapidly things are changing. So I would want to make sure that that's incorporated in there, if at all possible, as we look to apply this for 2023.
Yeah, I don't know, and Lou can speak to, I know he's on top of that information coming out. I don't know if there's any sense of how 2022 yet compares to 2010, but I know Lou is sort of ready and waiting for that information to become available to incorporate it into the rec demand model so that it is updated with that information. But I don't have a sense of what that means yet.
Yeah, I'll just hop on real quick and say that data, the survey has been completed and the data is currently going through like cleaning process and formatting. I haven't evaluated whether angler preferences have changed, but that I should be evaluating that data within the next few weeks here. So yeah, it's very close to being analyzed and then incorporated back into the demand model.
Michelle, were you reaching for your mic? No, you're good. Okay. Thank you. Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. So I know when we go through a lot of these processes, it's beneficial to try to slim them down for the things we're looking to refine in the future. Unfortunately, I don't think I've reached a point where I'm ready to remove any of these modeling procedures that have come out yet. Quite frankly, there's just many aspects of the public that have different priorities. I think understanding and seeing these things will start to provide some of that feedback, and hopefully they can continue to comment. I know in New Jersey, I think for many anglers, the slot process that we've pursued this year for angler satisfaction, as this has shown, as said it would be, has been an unmitigated success for many, many anglers. There are certainly those in the angling community that will never be satisfied other than taking home the most biggest fish they can. Obviously, the slot doesn't address that. I am sensitive to that. I am supportive of using whatever information here that we can as soon as possible, but I've raised this point at a couple different meetings. It's my understanding that the model approach that we're using here still uses only a single year of MRIP data for calibration of the model. We had conversation in the working group about possibly being able to change that. I believe work they've done in New England allows for the modeling work that they do there to allow multiple years of MRIP data. I think if nothing we've learned over time, that relying on MRIP in 1 year for anything is a scary proposition. So I know, we've had a lot of conversation through the working group, but I remain very concerned about putting this in practice, knowing that it relies on a single year of MRIP data for calibration. So I would encourage work before we use this for anything to find ways to address that concern.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Brandon?
Yeah, just quickly, because we don't have, I think it may get posted to the meeting materials, but there are a number of additional slides that we didn't get into. So Lou, right, we just need to calibrate the model to ensure to 1 year, because we just want to make sure that the model is working appropriately and estimating things properly with that 1 year of data. Can it produce those estimates from MRIP appropriately for that 1 year? Now, Lou has done a number of what we are calling out of year sort of simulations to look at other years. So Lou has run the model from 2016 through 2021 and has compared his model estimates compared to MRIP across all of those years to see how well it performs, and it performs well across all of those years. 2020, I think the results are a little bit different, quite a bit different, but I think there was also a lot of uncertainty in 2020 MRIP estimates because of the loss of data because of COVID. So I think we're okay there. So he's done a lot of additional work to demonstrate that the model is performing appropriately and looking at these other out of sample predictions in, like I said, from 2016 to 2021. Even though it's still only calibrated to 1 year of data, we're trying to make sure that it's matched up to that 1 year of data very specifically, but we've looked at it across many years and it still performs very well. And I would also say that Lou's model also incorporates other data components. It doesn't just include MRIP, it includes volunteer angler survey data, it includes American Littoral Society tagging information across all the different states. So we are incorporating other components of information into that model as well. So we've looked at what you've suggested, Adam, and have looked at it over multiple years, and it still performs very well across those other years. And I think there are some additional information in our backup slides so you can see.
Okay, thank you. All right, just a quick check where we are. I have a couple, actually, I have 2 more hands. I have a question of my own. And then what I'd like to do is go to the public after that, and then we'll start to wrap things up. So this is an important topic and a lot of work has gone into it. And I'm starting to get the sense as to where the board and the council are going with, you know, advice and recommendations for the use of this in moving forward. But let's take 2 more comments. We'll start with our New England liaison representative, Mr. Rick Bellavance. And then Dan Farnham, I'll come to you before I ask my question. Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was fortunate enough to be one of the core stakeholder members in this exercise, and I thought I'd just offer a couple of quick thoughts as the council considers moving forward with this tool. First, I think it is an important, powerful tool that should be considered by you guys as you think about managing these species. I want to take just a quick second to thank Brendan and Jonathan for their time kind of herding us along as stakeholders. It was a lot of work. We struggled, you know, quite a bit trying to understand this new way of thinking. And similar to the exchange between Dr. Duvall and Brendan, we had similar type questions and trying to understand where we were going through this exercise. And they did a great job of keeping us on track. The technical committee members also took a lot of time to help us understand it, and their understanding and experience and knowledge was just incredibly helpful for us to understand this tool. And I think it's really helpful and it'll be good to use in the future. Just a couple of quick points. If the council does decide to use this tool, I would definitely understand that the stakeholders in the public process are going to have some questions and concerns. So there's probably a need to commit some resources and time to helping that public process and helping the stakeholders that are going to be experiencing this for the first time to understand it and be able to comment appropriately. And Adam already touched on some of the data needs. These tools are powerful, but they're only as good as the data that goes into them. And the commitment for the council, the agency, the commission, and the states to continue working on recreational data improvements is important, and not to shy away from asking the recreational fishing community for more information, especially socio and economic, to help these new models perform as good as they can. So those are just 2 thoughts I had. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Rick, and thanks for your time that you in participating in this process. I appreciate that. Dan Farnham, go ahead, Dan.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, just a quick question or observation. I see on one of the slides here, I see a decrease in SSB for most of these management options or procedures. If there's a decrease in the SSB, would there not be a decrease in the ABC associated with that? Thank you.
Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Like I said, we are looking at these. I mean, these are all relative to those declines in the SSB are relative to the status quo option, and looking at what the median SSB was in the last 10 years of a 26-year projection. It's somewhat hard to say. Obviously, through the management procedure process that we simulated in this simulation framework that it is taking the ABC, it is taking the stock population and SSB, and it's calculating an OFL from that and creating an ABC then from the OFL, going through our typical sort of management process that we go through when setting that. But I wouldn't explicitly say that because this management procedure results in declines in SSB out, 16 years from now, that it automatically means we're going to have a decreasing ABC in 2023, for example. So there's some conflating things there. So relative to the status quo, many of these management procedures did result in an SSB that is lower than the status quo option. But how that translate out is a little bit more sort of nuanced than that in terms of what it actually means for regulation setting.
A follow-up, if I could, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Brandon, by the way.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's on a different line of thought, but during the presentation, I was just thinking with better angular satisfaction, due to an increase in the number of fish kept, do you anticipate an increase in effort on the recreational side because people are happier? And if so, was that metric incorporated in your models? Thank you.
So yes, so that was some of the outputs that we had produced. We are also predicting the number of trips that would take place. So as angler satisfaction and sort of, consumer surplus sort of changes under the different regulations, if anglers are more satisfied, they're able to take home more fish, they take more trips. And so you could see under most of those management procedures, there were more recreational fishing trips taken under those scenarios than under status quo. So yes, that was something we were calculating and a metric we looked at.
Yep, very good. Excellent, Brandon. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there are a couple hands still up, but what I'd like to do at this point is to start to get to the point of kind of wrapping up where we are as far as moving forward and next steps. So I think I may go to either maybe Chris or Tony to get a staff perspective as to what we might be able to do next. There's obviously support around the table for the use of this tool as soon as it's possible to implement into our measure setting process. But I think the details of how that would work and the integration of all the different elements coming together to form a measure is something that I'd like to get some perspective on from the staff side. So since Tony stepped away, I'll go to Chris first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So like Jay, I'm very excited about the MSC results and implications for our process, not only for 2023, but also moving forward. So as you might expect, we've had a lot of discussion at the staff level relative to how the HCR decision that we made, the harvest control rule decision that we made in June, intersects with the MSC results, right? So think about it, we made a decision. We haven't done anything yet with that June decision as it relates to actually doing the calculations for any of the species that are involved because we don't have the data yet, but we will. So that's step one. Before that, we actually have to finish the package and submit it to GARFO so that we can actually use it in December. So we also have to do that. However, we are prepared to use what the folks have come up with through this MSC process to actually propose 2023 rec specs, at least for summer flounder. Perhaps for black sea bass, pending the work that Gavin and other folks and Jay are going to be doing later this summer. So I would say that yes, in fact, we should use this. I think it offers us a next step or an evolution in our process and see how it works, see what it looks like. What that means from a scheduling perspective is that we'll have a series of monitoring committee meetings. The first one probably in October, and then later in the year that looks at how this MSC model can be used for summer flounder. So basically staff will start working with it, produce some things for the monitoring committee to look at. We'll have the technical conversations within the monitoring committee relative to whether or not it works, and then see what we have and bring that forward to the council and the board in December. So that's the long and the short of it. There's a lot there. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But again, very excited about the MSC results, very excited about their utility for 2023. There's just a few things that we have to work out. And remember, this HCR stuff, it's the first time that we're doing it, is complicated. We really haven't put the numbers down on paper yet to figure out what bin, remember we had this whole thing about bins, what bin we're going to be in for summer flounder or black sea bass or scud. So again, I think it'll work. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Chris. Any questions specific to Chris's comments at this time? Tom Fody, I see your hand up. Was that question, is that directed to Chris? Okay, his hand just went down. Any comments regarding Chris's comments? Okay, seeing none in the room, seeing none online, let's take this opportunity to go out to the public for comments, questions, thoughts. Can I get a show of hands from the public as to who might be interested? Okay, so I have 2 hands from the audience. I'm going to start with Greg DiDomenico, and then Mike will come to you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one brief question for Brandon. Brandon, I attended, I think, 4 out of the 5 discussions. And I was wondering, you played a very large emphasis on what alternatives would possibly lead to overfishing or would not lead to overfishing. There was a specific distinction between overfishing and overages. Did you do a like analysis of what alternatives would lead to overages as well?
Yes, so when we looked at sort of these biological implications, the only things that we looked at were the frequency of overfishing occurring and the potential for the stock to become overfished. So we did not run this we did not compare the results to a set RHL or a set ACL, right? So I think we'd want to evaluate to an ACL here because we're really focused on discards, but we did not run this specifically evaluating at an RHL or an ACL level. It was at a broader stock-wide perspective of overfishing and overfished sort of conditions.
Well, I would only request, and perhaps I should have made this more clear as a core stakeholder of the MSC evaluation, but I think the element of overages still hangs over this entire topic. I would ask that an analysis be done to determine whether or not your alternatives would lead to overages, because not only does that have the potential for skewing the percentages, the allocation percentages, which of course would make them meaningless, but it also, in my opinion, if you have overages, you also are potentially risking going into an overfished situation. So I think I think they're not mutually exclusive, and I would just request that the council understands this topic and makes a recommendation for that analysis to be done. Thank you.
Brandon?
Yeah, so again, that's where I think there are different distinctions between the role of the management strategy evaluation versus the role of the models within the management strategy evaluation. So again, the management strategy evaluation was to look at the broader sort of strategic view, long-term view of how these procedures perform and what those implications were at a stock-specific, at a stock-wide level. We can utilize the recreational demand model that Lou has created. We can determine what predicted harvest, what estimated harvest and discards would be in the, in the next year, for example, under a set of regulations and under a set of stock conditions, we can make those estimates, and then you can make those comparisons to an RHL or an ACL. So that's your tactical advice of using the models themselves versus what the goal of the management strategy evaluation was. So I think my sense from the council and board are that we want to utilize the model for thinking about measures in 2023, and that's where we will utilize the recreational demand model and Dr. McNamee's model to look at, okay, now that we have these models in place, let's compare them to an RHL or an ACL and how will they perform in 2023, for example, to these limits.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Greg, for your question. Mike Wayne?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. A lot of good questions, a lot of work done to get to this point. I'll echo the comments that Rick made. I think there's a really important component here for outreach to stakeholders so that they can understand how this interplays with all the other changes that are occurring for rec management. And I guess I'm going to ask a technical question right now. So could the model be used in a stock assessment way? Meaning, could this model be developed out to become an assessment model for these species in which we would use it to set ABC, OFL, et cetera?
I may punt to the modeling folks. So Gavin, Gavin, or I don't know if you have any specific thoughts or in regards to that.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Thanks for the question. I mean, I would sort of emphasize that that really wasn't the role of these analyses, is to develop an assessment model. This is really sort of thinking about the management cycle. We did not include in the management part of this process, the representation of the management process in the MSC simulations. We didn't include assessment models. So this wasn't necessarily testing the performance of things to evaluate, to determine ABCs, et cetera. This is a projection simulation model. That said, the MSC is a way of evaluating performance of options for monitoring, assessment, and management. So the framework potentially could be used to test the relative performance of different approaches for other aspects of the management process. And that, as we have discussed, includes, the HCRs, but it also potentially could include options and decisions around the assessment process too. But I don't think, but I would, that wasn't what the project, the experiments that we set up, that wasn't what they were designed to evaluate. I hope that clarifies that a little bit.
Yeah, it does. And thanks for the comments about it not being the objective of this approach. I was just thinking longer term. And my question was really based on how does this intersect with our specification process, which, as we highlighted, is ripe for some outreach with the stakeholders. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Mike. Okay, I'm going to go to the public. I've got James Fletcher. James, you're up.
My question is, since the 80s, the fishing industry, commercial and recreational, has asked for total length, no discard on the recreational side. Can you explain why, after 35 or 40 years, it has never been put in a model? And on the second point, Will you explain why only the prestigious elite that have the ability financially to fish in the EEZ is represented in the models that you have run, where the deprived shoreside fishermen who would be able to keep fish under a total length are totally ignored? Can you explain why a total length model was not run? Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, James. So the core group did talk about a total length limit option. It was on the table sort of earlier in our discussions, and as we had to begin to craft those specific management procedures that we were interested in, it did not rise to the priorities that the core stakeholder group felt were of greatest interest amongst the group. So we looked at other management procedures other than a total length limit, although again, we talked about it. We talked about it for the first several meetings, but as we needed to identify priorities, that one fell below the priorities. And specifically to the shore mode, we talked a lot about the shore mode fishery. We had people on our core stakeholder group that identified as shore mode fishermen or fisherwomen. One of the women on the core group was that's the only way she fished. And we had a number of other folks that, fished from shore. So we had a lot of perspectives. We talked a lot about why we might want to consider dropping size limits and what those implications might mean for the shore mode. The core group was interested in looking at these metrics by sector so that we could evaluate those implications for the shore mode. So that was certainly heavily on our mind and was part of our process of getting core stakeholder group members onto the group, was making sure we had shore mode fishermen on the group itself.
But you did not run the model. Explain why. Did the group of prestigious elite that can afford to fish in the EEZ carry it away from those that need to fish for food? I am frustrated beyond belief since I have participated in this fishery since before Manguson Act as a commercial representative with the United National Fishermen's Association, and I find myself having to put forth for the recreational, and it is extremely frustrating that no model was run. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks, James. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to bring this back to the council and the board at this time. I think we've heard a lot of good discussion and a lot of support for moving forward. Chris offered a path forward that he and staff, along with the commission staff, would be working on into the fall, into perhaps being able to use this tool in our measure setting process for summer flounder, at least for 2023. So I think, without any additional comment at this time, I think I'm going to ask the council or the board if there's any objection to kind of following along with what Chris mentioned, and perhaps not having a joint meeting, but maybe getting feedback on where we stand by October. The council has a meeting in October, and the commission has its annual meeting in October as well. So maybe at that point, there could be some follow-up, at least to where we are with potential use of this for 2023. I don't see any hands. I'm assuming the hands that were up on the screen were up from a previous question or comment, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. We're well beyond time.
I have my hand up for a long time. This time,
yeah, go ahead. You've got the last word, Tom. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't usually disagree with and I'm not disagreeing with Adam. He's talking to a lot different people than I've been talking to, but I've been getting a lot of complaints about the slot limit in New Jersey just because of the limited slot. It's only 1 inch, and there's a lot of people complaining about that. It also was complaining to me that they see people high grading because they're only allowed to keep one big fish. They throw the one dead fish they have to get a bigger fish when they catch a bigger fish. So I just wanted to put that on the record as doing it. I support going forward with this, but I also wanted to hear the concerns that I've heard from a number of fishermen.
All right, appreciate that, Tom. Thanks for your comment. Okay, seeing no objections on the path forward, I'm going to take that as a recommendation by the board and the council. And so therefore that concludes our business. Brandon, hopefully you got the feedback that you were looking for from the discussion today. I'm going to turn to my co-chair, Justin Davis, for anything in addition to what's already been discussed. Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the only thing I'd say is I'd encourage all the board members to give some thought to the different management options that were presented today as part of the management strategy evaluation, and just give some thought about potential applicability of those measures for 2023, what might work for your state, what might not, and just give that some thought, because I think at some point we would want to follow up and give some feedback to the monitoring committee on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Justin. Thank you. All right, so that concludes our business under this agenda item. Let's take a break and come back at 10 till 12, and we'll pick up with summer flounder specifications. Thanks.
So what else Dr. Mathers have to say?
All right, this is everybody's 2-minute warning. We're going to start the meeting back up in 2 minutes. All right, if folks can start to take their seats, we're going to get things back underway here in about a minute. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Excuse me. We're going to pick right up where we left off and continue our discussions on summer flounder. I'm going to turn things over to Kylie Dancy, who is participating virtually with us this morning. And so Kylie is going to be discussing with us the 2023 specifications for summer flounder. And without any further delay, Kylie, if you're ready to go, you can go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay, I'm sorry, everyone, that I couldn't be there in person, and I'll be giving a presentation on 2023 specifications for summer flounder. And in the interest of time, I'll apologize if I sort of zip through some of this stuff. I'll talk about stock status and the data update we received this year, recent fishery performance and advisory panel comments, SSC and monitoring committee recommendations, and the objectives for the discussion are for the council and board to recommend revised 2023 sector-specific limits for the commercial and recreational fisheries, which are needed due to the revised commercial recreational allocation that you all adopted back in December of 2021, and that is pending implementation for January 1, 2023. And then review commercial management measures and recommend changes to those if warranted. So for stock status, the last model update was the 2021 management track assessment, which showed that summer flounder was not overfished and overfishing was not occurring in 2019. Spawning stock biomass was 86% of the target, and the 2019 F was 81% of the FMSY threshold. So this figure is the total catch and fishing mortality from the assessment over time. Total catch in the green line generally been declining since about 2011. The fishing mortality rate has generally been around or a bit below the F threshold in recent years, again with 2019 estimated at 81% of that FMSY proxy. So this figure shows spawning stock biomass and recruitment, and the spawning stock biomass target in the top dashed black line and the overfished threshold in the solid horizontal line. So spawning stock biomass peaked in 2003 and has generally declined since 2011, although there's a bit of an uptick since 2017. And then recruitment shown in the bars here has generally been below the time series average in most years since 2011 for unknown reasons. However, the 2018 recruitment was estimated to be above average and the largest recruitment event since 2009. 2019 was below the time series average, but still a bit above average for recent years. Our 2022 data update from the Science Center provides updated federal trawl survey indices. There were no bottom trawl surveys conducted in 2020, and the spring survey index of summer flounder in blue decreased by about 41% between 2019 and 2022. And then the fall index in red increased by 6% between 2019 and 2021. The data update also includes this length distribution figure, again, suggesting that above average year class in 2018 with average to below average recruitment since then. This figure shows commercial and recreational landings through 2021 and dead discards through 2019. So we do not currently have dead discard estimates for summer flounder for 2020 or 2021 due to data issues. Recreational landings have generally been decreasing since about 2013 with a bit of a jump in 2020, but in 2021 they were pretty low, estimated at 6.82 million pounds, which is the lowest estimate in pounds since 1989. This was about a 32% decrease from the 2020 estimate. Commercial landings show a bit of a similar trend with decreases since 2012, but then followed by a rising trend again starting in 2019 when the quotas were substantially increased with the new assessment. In 2021, commercial landings were 10.36 million pounds, which is about a 14% increase compared to 2020. And then dead discards over the past about 10 years, commercial dead discard estimates have been pretty stable and recreational dead discards have decreased slightly. Recreational fishery performance for the rec fishery, we have to evaluate against the harvest limit and the ACL using the old time series of MRIP data for years through 2018, and then new MRIP data since 2019. So harvest relative to the harvest limit has been a bit variable. We had a really close estimate in 2019, and then 2016 and 2020 overages 14 and 30%, and in 2017 and 18 having underages of 15 and 24%. And again, 2021 was also under. When you look at dead discards to evaluate catch against the annual catch limit, again, we don't have the 2020 and 2021 information, so we can't do that evaluation for those years. But prior to that, the last time the recreational ACL was exceeded was 2016, and that was by 12%. For the commercial fishery, since 2016, there's only been 1 year with a commercial quota overage and 2017 with a 3% overage. Since the quotas were notably increased in mid-2019 and have remained at those higher levels, the commercial fishery has been under harvesting their quota by between 17 and 21%. Looking at ACL evaluations, there was a larger overage in 2017 and smaller overages in 2016 and 18. This is due primarily or entirely to dead discard estimates being higher than expected. Again, we saw those quota increases in mid-2019, and for 2019, we see a notable ACL underage. So even though we don't have the information for 2020 and 2021, we would think it's unlikely that there would have been ACL overages there, just given the magnitude of the quota underages. So in 2022, this is the landings trajectory so far with the current year in blue and the prior year in yellow. It's tracking pretty well. The current year's quota is a bit higher than it was in 2021. As of August 3rd, about 44% of the 2022 quota has been landed. So I'm going to move on to the advisory panel fishery performance report, starting with a few slides that have comments for all three of the species in this FMP, summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. This was from the advisory panel meeting on June 21st. So primarily the concern that was highlighted throughout the meeting was several advisors talking about the impacts of increasing costs in 2022, including mostly fuel costs, but as well also supply chain issues affecting costs for other things like bait, supplies, equipment, affecting both commercial and recreational fisheries. So this is the biggest issue that advisors felt was facing the fisheries this year, and advisors said commercial fisheries aren't going to be able to operate profitably and are struggling to pay crew. A few advisors said increased prices are resulting in reduced recreational fishing efforts. They're observing fewer boats on the water and in marinas. For hire businesses are incurring higher costs and having to charge more for trips. There's been, one advisor noticed a decline in for hire clients, including from regulars. Clients are being a little bit more selective on how many and what trips they take. Another advisor noted increased costs are coming at a time of more restrictive regulations for species like scup and black sea bass, which is going to further reduce effort. So COVID-related comments, one advisor noted that the world is sort of returning to a bit of a post-COVID normal. There's less concern about gatherings. This advisor thought there might be reduced recreational fishing effort this year compared to the past 2 years when fishing was viewed as a relatively low-risk outdoor activity. Increases in indoor gatherings might not mean a greatly increased seafood demand, though, given the current state of the economy. And one advisor commented about imports that are negatively impacting the U.S. market for U.S. caught fish and suggested the need to further investigate this issue. So there was one advisor noting concern that MRIP doesn't provide an estimate of total anglers fishing in the EEZ. This advisor also recommended mandatory electronic reporting on in the recreational fishery to improve recreational data. One advisor was concerned that the new harvest control rule system in the recreational fishery is not going to prevent overfishing and that this is going to negatively impact the commercial sector. And then another advisor supported consideration of a common minimum trawl mesh size for all 3 species of 5 inches during the months of November through April. Another advisor supported this, but preferred 4 inches and a reduced commercial minimum fish size for all 3 species. One advisor did oppose a reduced minimum fish size for scup. So finally, for general comments, one advisor voiced concerns about the Outer Banks in North Carolina being washed away due to sea level rise and storms. Another advisor was concerned about addition of chemicals to the water, including disinfectants used to kill the COVID virus, and this should be investigated. One advisor suggested the influence of environmental cycles that are impacting fisheries should be further studied. Moving on to summer flounder specific comments for market and economic issues, one advisor said January through April this year, 2022, commercial fishermen reported unusually low prices for summer flounder, but that they have since recovered. This might have been driven partially by a lack of hospitality market in New York, where demand is still down due to COVID. Another advisor from New York said summer flounder prices have increased there for the first time in a couple of years to the $5 to $6 per pound range. And then as we talked about under general comments, several advisors were concerned about high fuel prices, and specific to summer flounder, this was noted that fishermen are not necessarily going to fish as far as they typically do for summer flounder, which might affect use of permits that fishermen hold in other states. So for example, some of the fishermen that are permitted to land in Virginia or North Carolina may not steam there to do so. And another advisor agreed with that, stating that this is going to cause lower landings in those states, and that's going to contribute to further quota underages on the commercial side. For environmental and general fishing trends, one advisor noted that the current assessment includes data through 2019 and shows increasing estimated biomass over 2017 to 19, but the recreational harvest over that time period is either flat or decreasing. So he's curious what the next assessment will show and if it will more closely track, landings will track with estimated biomass trends from the assessment. 3 advisors said this year summer flounder didn't seem to be inshore or in the bays yet at the time of the meeting, June 21st, thought that this was maybe due to water temperatures, and one suggested that they were starting to show up at that time. General management issues, one advisor suggested that the decline in recruitment over the last 10 plus years is because the spawning stock biomass came to consist of smaller fish due to regulations, and that drove smaller fish due to regulations that drove increased harvest of larger female fish. He stated spawning stock biomass was lower in the 90s, but recruitment was higher. And because fisheries were harvesting smaller fish and allowing larger fish to spawn, and emphasized that management needs to change its policies to recognize the importance of the big old fat fecund female fish. Our favorite acronym. So recreational management issues. A few advisors commented on the 2022 recreational measures in New Jersey, which we talked about a little bit with the last agenda item, that slot limit of 2 fish, 17 to 18 inches, and then 1 above 18. One advisor was supportive of this measure, hoping that it would protect more larger females and have positive impacts on the stock, but also hoped that the slot limit could be widened next year. And another advisor did express some hesitation about the slot limit, stating that he believes that a lot more fish have been harvested in southern New Jersey this year. And he was concerned that harvest is going to notably increase to an extent that it could have negative impacts on the fishery in the long run. And he did note also that that it might slightly reduce discards, but he does think people are going to continue to fish until they catch a big fish, and such that harvest of larger breeding fish might not be substantially reduced. For research recommendations, one advisor said he believes low summer flounder recruitment is caused not by the number of eggs produced, but by predation on larvae in the first year of life, and suggested researchers determine what's eating them and how that's impacting the stock. One advisor talked about wind farms, extensive wind farms throughout the continental shelf being likely, and that we need to know how this is going to impact summer flounder migrations and optimal habitat, saying that they could be affected by the cables in the magnetic fields, for example. One advisor expressed concern that we don't know as much as we should about migration patterns of summer flounder beyond a general east-west pattern. There's some interplay there with the stock distribution shift. This advisor also suggested that we get a better handle on the question of summer flounder recruitment by adjusting our sampling locations to better account for changes in stock distribution. And then finally, this advisor recommended that we find better ways to conduct population surveys rather than trawl surveys, which disturb habitat and kill a lot of fish. So he thought newer and better technology might exist to conduct these surveys. We received a couple email comments, one stating that flounder fishing is decent in Delaware, but got off to a late start due to cold water. There was an email comment concerned about the impacts of climate change on habitat and migrations, and then a comment recommending more research on breeding habits and spawning locations and potential harvest restrictions during the spawning season. Another advisor emailed that the commercial net size is specified incorrectly, that it should be 5 inches for all 3 species, and that we need to consider the recreational total length limit with no discarding and cell phone reporting required, and this would benefit low-income shore fishermen. Okay, so coming back to the catch limits for 2023, starting with the ABC, the SSC met in late July and recommended maintaining the previously adopted 2023 ABC. So this was adopted last year by the council and board as part of a constant ABC approach for 2022-2023, and that ABC is 33.12 million pounds. So the ABC would then remain unchanged between this year and next year. So back in December 2021, you all approved revisions to the commercial recreational allocation for summer flounder, and this is now a catch-based allocation, which makes deriving these sector-specific ACLs very easy and formulaic. So we apply the revised allocation of 55% commercial, 45% recreational to the ABC to get the commercial ACL of 18.21 million pounds and a recreational ACL of 14.9 million pounds. So the next step in the process is consideration of management uncertainty, where the monitoring committee and then ultimately the council and board consider whether to recommend reductions from either or both the ACLs to the ACTs to account for management uncertainty. The monitoring committee recommended continued application of no deduction for management uncertainty, the same as what was adopted last year, so that the ACTs are set equal to the ACLs for 2023. Just briefly, for the justification for the commercial fishery, the landings are well monitored and well controlled. There is in-season closure authority. And then for summer flounder, again, we've seen recent commercial landings underages since 2019 after the quota increase in mid-2019. We did have an issue a couple years ago with commercial ACLs being exceeded due to higher than expected discards, but this seems to be an issue of under predicting discards in lower quota years. So hopefully we can address that going forward. The monitoring committee does not think that's an issue going forward with the current quota levels. On the recreational side, we've had some variable performance relative to the harvest limit, but we've had no recent ACL overages that we know of through 2019. The monitoring committee did note some fluctuation in the harvest estimates, specifically with 2020, and then that drop in 2021. Noted that this could be due to variation in effort or variability in the estimates, but it could also be related to the fact that 2020 estimates used a good amount of imputed data due to that COVID-19 related data gaps. So given overall recent trends in the summer flounder harvest, the monitoring committee didn't see a benefit of considering a reduction in the ACL for the recreational fishery. Similarly, there's some uncertainty with the harvest control rule approach for 2023, but the monitoring committee did not see indication of a need for an additional buffer on the rec side. So to get the commercial quota and recreational harvest limit, here's a somewhat simplified version of the new flow chart with those revised allocations. Basically, once we have the ACTs, we need a recommendation for projected dead discards in each sector, and then that is subtracted from the ACTs to arrive at the commercial quota and the RHL. So to recommend dead discards for each sector, staff considered a couple different methods, and the monitoring committee briefly discussed those. We recommend that the monitoring committee recommended, as of right now, the typical method that we've used in recent years is the best approach to apply for fluke for 2023. So this method is where total projected dead discards are provided with the ABC projections that are provided by the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And we take those total expected dead discards and divide that into expected sector-specific discards using a 3-year moving average proportion of dead discards by sector. So last year we used 2017 to 2019 data because that was the most recent discard data we have had, and unfortunately that is still the most recent discard data we have. So the monitoring committee recommended maintaining those proportions, which are 59% from the recreational fishery and 41% from the commercial fishery. So there was no change to the ABC, no change to the ABC projections of total dead discards, and this would mean essentially that the monitoring committee recommends keeping the same projected dead discards for each sector that were used when we last set 2022 and 2023 specifications. So under those recommended discards, which are 2.95 million pounds for the commercial fishery and 4.28 million pounds for the rec fishery, this table summarizes the resulting limits with a comparison to the current 2023 measures. So no change to the OFL and ABC. There's a slight change in the ACLs. The commercial ACL decreases by 1%. The recreational ACL would increase by 2%. And the recommended commercial quota is 15.27 million pounds, which is a 2% decrease from the previously implemented. And then the harvest limit would be 10.62 million pounds, which is a 3% increase from the current limit. So commercial measures, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The staff and the monitoring committee recommended no changes to the current commercial measures, including minimum fish size or the possession limits triggering the minimum mesh size requirements. The monitoring committee, as I think most of you know, the monitoring committee and the council and board have discussed mesh size issues and exemption regulations a couple times in recent years, and has previously identified some additional analysis and some industry input that's needed to address a couple of issues for all 3 species, but a couple more issues for summer flounder. The council and board have identified this as sort of a still a priority, but a lower priority given other ongoing actions. And so essentially we were unable to make any progress on these evaluations in 2022 due to these other issues. So the monitoring committee recommends for 2023, no changes to the current minimum mesh size. Again, has identified some further evaluation needed of the equivalents of 5.5 diamond and 6-inch square. I can go into more details if there are questions on that. The monitoring committee also recommended no changes in 2023 to the small mesh exemption program, and this allows authorized small mesh vessels to land more than the incidental possession limit that triggers the minimum mesh size east of this line shown in the figure. We do look at observer data every year to think about whether those vessels are discarding more than 10% of their summer flounder catch. We unfortunately were unable to update this analysis for the November 2020 to April 2021 time period, just given observer data access issues that staff has been having. There's a couple things that the monitoring committee had flagged in the past as a potential concern about increasing percentages of summer flounder discards, but thinks that this is due to low quotas in those years that would resolve itself once we have data reflecting the increased quotas. The other exemption is a fly net exemption. Similarly, the monitoring committee recommends no changes for 2023. We look at North Carolina data each year for this. There haven't been summer flounder landed in that fishery in recent years. And the monitoring committee recommends no changes for 2023, but there are some issues that the monitoring committee wants to further explore related to past comments about use of high-rise nets and whether or not those fall under the definition of a fly net. And that, I think, about sums up the commercial measures. So sorry for speeding through that, but the decision points that I mentioned earlier are listed here on the slide, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kylie, for the presentation. Let me look to folks around the table or online if anyone has any questions for Kylie at this time. Chris Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Kylie, for the presentation. This is question, it's a weird MRIP related question that sort of ties into management uncertainty. And I don't know, Kylie, if you'll be able to answer this or possibly someone from the Science Center or Garfo, but I think I remember hearing that the 2020 MRIP estimates are going to be re-examined again, now that we have 2021 data to get a better sense of what in terms of interpolating what those estimates might be. And if that's the case, when would we expect revised 2020 catch estimates? Because I think that's going to be informative regarding any sort of management uncertainty now or in the future for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. Thanks.
I can take that. So yes, I believe they were looked at using 2021 data in the imputation methods to see if it improved the 2020 imputed estimates. And I believe what they determined was that it didn't improve things. So as far as I understand, those 2020 estimates are now final and not going to be changed, but perhaps someone from Garfo can correct me if I'm wrong there.
Okay, thanks, Kylie. Thanks, Chris. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This goes to Kylie's last slide, the slide on the screen. I would note that the monitoring committee in their July 28th memo and the staff memo on July 14th, the monitoring committee says they continue to support further analysis and consideration of modifications for several issues related to mesh size regs and exemptions. And that goes back to somewhere around 2015. So in my opinion, in particular, the fluke small mesh exemption area needs to be either revisited, revised, or removed. Fly net definition certainly needs to be looked at, and the Hasbrook et al. Work on mesh selectivity that pertains not only to fluke but to black sea bass and scup should be considered. So my question is to you, Mr. Chairman, or perhaps to Dr. Moore, can we allocate or perhaps reallocate some time to the commercial sector to discuss these issues that may benefit the commercial sector as a 2023 priority? That's my question.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That's exactly the answer to your question, would be that we can have that as part of the discussion that the executive committee of the MID will have regarding 2023 priorities in October, and then that will be followed up by a discussion by the full council in December to set those as priorities for 2023. So I'll look to Kylie and Chris and you know, to make sure that that is part of that discussion that starts in October, as far as setting that up for possible work in 2023. Does that sound good, Eric?
Yeah, I'd like to hear what Dr. Moore has to say. It's his staff, so I'd like to know.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have had this conversation with the staff as well. We think it's a good idea to look at the small mesh exemption program, the fly net exemption, as well as the mesh stuff that you referenced. So as Mike indicated, in October, you'll see a list of things that we think should be done for 2023. Those will be on the list. And certainly, I think that'll generate good conversation in October. And then we'll take the final list to the council in December and see if in fact they want to do that for 2023. I think it's a good idea.
I appreciate the consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Chris. Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a question that is sort of relevant to all three species, well, more than all three species, but it has to do with discards. I know in the staff memo and the monitoring committee memo that there's been a delay in processing the 2021 observer data. And it sounds like perhaps some of the delay is also due to getting the new catch accounting system maybe up and running as well. And I was just, you know, wondering when we could expect those discard estimates. You know, in other words, will they be available by our October meeting, you know, by the end of the year when we're talking about rec measures? And then also wondering about discard estimates for 2020. I know there were a lot of challenges in 2020 with the observer program. And so is there any kind of plan to try to develop any estimates of discards for 2020 that, you know, whether we're scaling something, you know, according to the number of trips that were taken or what? So just a couple questions there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'll go to Kylie first and see if Kylie has anything to offer, and then maybe turn to the service if there's still some questions that are unanswered. Go ahead, Kylie.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is certainly a conversation that staff is having that's kind of ongoing to figure out when we can get those discard estimates. I believe that Garfo is coming up with some discard estimates for 2020 for their catch accounting purposes. And I also think that, as you mentioned, Michelle, that there's the new catch accounting system that's going into place to estimate discards is, as I understand it, being kind of rolled out with each assessment update for each species. So I don't think that currently we anticipate getting those discard estimates from the Science Center until maybe next year, but someone else may have more details about exactly when that's going to happen. But this is something we've been talking a lot about as staff, about how and when we're going to get discard estimates. So to be determined.
All right, thanks, Kylie. I'll look to the services. Sarah or Jay, do you guys have anything you want to add?
Dr. Hare is actually online and can respond to some of the questions related to the data and the estimates.
Okay, John, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Bland, for recognizing me. Yeah, so on the CAMS, the Catch Accounting Monitoring System, that system has been developed and it is currently being used to estimate landings, and that has been available for the spring assessments, and the group is actively working on being able to also estimate discards, and that work is ongoing. As to the timeline, I don't have that in front of me, so I can't talk about the timeline for that. And then the observer program has also been working hard to catch up on the the backlog of observer trips. They're getting their full suite of debriefers up and running. And again, I don't have the specific time line for the provision of that observer data, but I can get that and get back to you.
I appreciate that, John. Thank you. Okay, seeing no other hands for questions at this time, before us we have decision points. I believe the second point here regarding commercial management measures has already been addressed through the questions that were answered by Eric Reed. And so I'd like to turn our attention to the recommendation for revisions to the 2023 ACLs, ACTs, commercial quota, and RHL to account for revisions in the sector allocation amendment. Staff has prepared a motion to keep us focused on that. So I think at this time I'd ask for that motion to be brought before the council and the board, and for anyone either on the council or the board that would like to make that motion, now's the time. After we get it up on the screen. Okay, so in front of you, you should be able to see the revised motion or the draft motion. Is there anyone from the council or the board that would like to make that motion on behalf of the council or the board? Joe Semino, you're going to make that on behalf of the board and the council? Okay, could you go ahead and read that into the record?
Sure, Mr. Chair. Move to revise the 2023 specifications for summer flounder such that the recreational ACL equals ACT equal to 14.9 million pounds and the RHL equal to 10.62 million pounds. In addition, the commercial ACL equal to ACT at 18.21 million pounds and the commercial quota equal to 15.27 million pounds.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So Joe's made this motion on behalf of the board and the council. Can I ask for a second on behalf of the council? Michelle Duvall seconds that on behalf of the council, and I have Emerson Hasbrook making the second on behalf of the board. Is there any discussion on the motion by board members or council members at this time? Is there any public comment to the motion? Anyone online by phone only that would like to speak? Okay, seeing no hands and hearing no voices, let me ask, we'll go ahead and take this motion up on behalf of the council, and then I'll turn to my co-chair, Justin Davis, to call the question of the board. So to the council, is there any objection to the motion? If you object to this motion, please raise your hand. Seeing no objection, are there any abstentions? With no abstentions, the motion carries the council by consent. Justin, it's all you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to the board, are there any objections to the motion? Anybody who objects to the motion, please raise your hand. Okay, not seeing any hands. Do we have any abstentions? I'm not seeing any abstentions, so the motion passes the board by consent.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Tony Kearns?
Just a perfection, since it's a final action, could we just write motion carries by unanimous consent? I know it's picky, but.
That's fine. Yeah, we can put that, we can put it in both lines if you'd like, Tony. Okay, so Kylie, I believe that's all that's before us. Bonnie, I saw your hand. You're okay? Did you have anything you wanted to ask? Okay. Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Sorry about that. I missed you as we were discussing things earlier. So Adam Nowalski.
Thanks. So in light of what we're now doing with bluefish in setting our recreational measures at this time during the year, we've had discussion about trying to get all the species earlier in the year so we don't go through a mad rush in December, February timeframe. I don't know if we need to have the question answered here today, but I think I'd like brought forward in the near future what specifically we would need to change to get all of our recreational species on the same schedule the way they used to be. Bluefish, summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, all being done in December. We now have the disconnect of that timeline. Let's try to bring them back together. I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And Chris leaned over while you were speaking and asked me to just say that that'll be discussed in October at our meeting in October. Is there anything else? Kylie, are we all set? Is there anything else you need from the council or the board at this time?
I think we're all set.
Okay. I'll check with Dustin, who's with us online. Dustin, is there anything else you need on behalf of the board?
No, Dustin is on just by phone, so not sure if he's.
Okay,
Right.
I think we're all set. I want to thank you guys for putting the presentation together. And that concludes our business before us this morning and early afternoon. We're going to go ahead and break for lunch for an hour. We'll reconvene at 1:30 to take up the SCUP 2023 specifications. See you back at 1:30.